Hey guys, tonight we're talking about the Battle of Agincourt, and I need you to understand something that makes absolutely no sense. France had 3 times England's population. They possessed the wealthiest kingdom in Europe. Their knights were considered the finest warriors in Christendom, trained from childhood in the art of war. They fielded an army of 30,000 men against 6,000 starving, diseased English soldiers led by a king so sick he could barely sit on his horse. France lost. They didn't just lose, they were slaughtered like animals in a muddy field, their greatest nobles piled in heaps so high you couldn't see the ground beneath the corpses. In 3 hours on October 25th, 1415, the mightiest military power in Europe was destroyed by a dying army that had spent the previous month shitting itself to death from dysentery. The French thought they were going on a hunting expedition. They were right about one thing. They were the prey. Dear viewers, our big goal is to reach 1,000 subscribers on this channel, and with your support we can achieve it. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them. We're sincerely grateful to everyone who helps us achieve this goal. Also, write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious to see people from all over the world brought together by a single story. And now, let's move on to today's story. You're a French knight in 1415. You've never questioned that France is the centre of civilization, the heart of Christendom, blessed by God above all other kingdoms. Your grandfather fought at Crécy, your father at Poitiers, both disasters where French nobility died by the thousands to English arrows. But those battles happened generations ago, lessons your father's generation refused to learn. You know with absolute certainty that French knights are superior warriors, that English peasant archers are beneath contempt, that victory in battle comes from courage and noble blood, not tactics or discipline. The priests say God favours the righteous. Your armour cost more than a village produces in a year. That morning the omen seemed perfect. Clear sky after days of rain, your warhorse eager and strong, the English trapped with their backs to a river. Your sword was blessed by a bishop 3 days prior, its blade inscribed with prayers. The weight of the chainmail under your plate armour felt like God's own protection. Every link a prayer, 70 pounds of steel that made you invincible. The smell that morning wasn't normal combat sweat and leather. It was wine from the previous night's celebration mixed with roasting meat from breakfast. Confidence so thick you could taste it like copper on your tongue. Drums beat steadily from the English position across the field, a sound like a dying heartbeat trying to maintain rhythm. The mud squelched under your horse's hooves, deep enough to swallow a man's boot to the ankle. You could hear nobles arguing about which English lords they'd capture for ransom, their voices carrying across the morning air like merchants haggling over prices. A raven landed on a stake the English had planted, cawed twice, and flew toward your lines. Small detail, but some men crossed themselves. France had been humiliating England for decades. The 100 Years' War was nearly finished, or so everyone believed. Edward III had claimed the French throne back in 1337, insisting his mother's bloodline gave him rights over the French king. Absurd. The English had won battles through treachery and luck, but France had ground them down year after year, reclaiming territory, reducing their continental holdings to a few coastal towns. By 1415, England controlled almost nothing. Calais in the north, a toehold in Gascony, scattered fortresses that would fall eventually. The French strategy had worked perfectly. Outlast the English, bleed them economically, wait for them to collapse under the weight of maintaining armies across the Channel. Then Henry V invaded. Young, barely 28, he landed at Harfleur in August with 12,000 men and delusions of recreating his great-grandfather Edward III's conquests. The French laughed. King Charles VI was insane. literally prone to fits where he believed he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. But France didn't need a functional king. The Dauphin and the great nobles commanded armies, administered justice, collected taxes. The kingdom functioned despite the mad king in his palace, perhaps better than if he'd been competent and interfering. France's population exceeded 15 million. England barely managed 4 million, and half of those were Welsh, Scottish, or Irish subjects who hated English rule. The French treasury overflowed with wealth from the richest agricultural land in Europe. French nobles could field armies from their own resources without royal support. Henry's invasion looked suicidal from the start. He'd brought siege equipment, clearly planning to take fortified cities, which meant slow, grinding warfare that favoured the defender. France could afford to lose a few towns. England couldn't afford a single prolonged campaign. Every week Henry spent in France cost a fortune his bankrupt kingdom didn't possess. The French strategy was obvious. Avoid battle, let disease and logistics destroy the English army, then mop up survivors. Simple, effective. It had worked against better English armies than Henry's, but Henry took Harfleur. The siege should have lasted a week, maybe 2 if the garrison proved stubborn. It took 5 weeks of brutal, grinding assault. English soldiers died by the hundreds from dysentery, their bowels turning liquid, shitting blood until they were too weak to stand. The famous bloody flux. It killed more soldiers than any sword. Men who survived Harfleur's walls left the siege looking like animated corpses, skin hanging off their bones, barely able to carry their weapons. Henry's grand army of 12,000 had shrunk to fewer than 6,000 effectives. His plan to march through Normandy conquering cities was impossible now. He lacked the numbers, the supplies, the time. French scouts reported all of this back to the Dauphin and the great nobles assembling the army. The English were finished. They'd won their siege and accomplished nothing except destroying themselves in the process. Henry faced a choice between 2 humiliations: retreat by sea back to England, abandoning his invasion after a single minor city, or march 150 miles north to Calais through enemy territory with an army that could barely walk. Either option would destroy his credibility as king. The French assumed he'd take the ships home, sensible, safe, cowardly, but alive. Henry chose the march. Insane. The decision shocked French commanders who'd assumed the English king possessed at least basic survival instincts. 150 miles through hostile territory, every river crossing contested, every town closed against them, no possibility of resupply, pursued by French forces that outnumbered them 5-1 at minimum. The French didn't even need to fight a battle. Just shadow the English, block river crossings, let starvation and disease finish what Harfleur had started. Henry's army would collapse on the march. Dozens would desert every night. By the time they reached the Somme River, they'd be a mob of sick refugees, not an army. The march began in mid-October. French cavalry shadowed the English column constantly, staying just out of longbow range, counting heads, reporting strength. Every day the English looked weaker. They were eating nuts, berries, whatever they could forage from fields already harvested for winter. Some soldiers were so weak they threw away their armour just to keep moving. Others abandoned their weapons. Dysentery continued killing men every night. The French could hear the English camp from miles away. Thousands of men with dysentery produce a sound and smell unlike anything else in warfare. The stench carried on the wind, a rotting sweetness mixed with human waste that made even hardened soldiers gag. Henry kept pushing north. His army managed perhaps 15 miles per day, sometimes less. A healthy army could march 25 miles easily. These men were shuffling, stumbling, many barefoot because their boots had rotted off their feet. French forces blocked every bridge over the Somme. The English marched upstream, searching for a crossing, adding miles to their journey. Days passed. The French on the opposite bank taunted them, waved food, drank wine in full view of the starving English. Some French nobles treated it as entertainment, following the English march like spectators at a sporting event. Finally, the English found a crossing, a ford at Agincourt, the water low enough to wade. The French hadn't blocked it because they assumed no army in that condition could manage the crossing under harassment. They were wrong. English archers provided covering fire while men-at-arms crossed, water up to their chests, current trying to sweep away anyone who stumbled. They made it across, exhausted, soaked, but across. The French army stopped playing games. Orders went out, assemble every available man, block the road to Calais, end this farce. The summons went to every French noble within 50 miles. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, a chance to destroy an English army, capture their king, end the war permanently. Knights rode through the night to join the muster. The army swelled beyond 30,000 men, perhaps 40,000, exact counts lost in the chaos of nobles bringing their own retinues, each contingent maintaining separate camps and supply trains. 3 dukes commanded major divisions. 90 nobles of the highest rank led their own companies. Over 1,500 knights wore full plate armour, the finest military technology Europe had ever produced. Supporting them were thousands of men-at-arms, crossbowmen, infantry, cavalry, an army that represented the entire military might of the wealthiest kingdom in Christendom. The French intercepted the English road to Calais near the village of Agincourt. Henry's scouts reported the French position on October 24th. The English were trapped. Behind them, the Somme. Ahead, an army that outnumbered them at least 5-1. No possibility of retreat. No chance of outrunning French cavalry. No option but to fight. The French had their victory. They just needed to formalize it in battle, which would take perhaps an hour once the fighting started. Most of the time would be spent processing prisoners and dividing ransoms. The actual killing of English common soldiers would go quickly. They were already half dead from disease and starvation. The nobles would surrender once they realized the situation. Civilized capture, ransom negotiations, everyone acting according to the proper codes of chivalry. That night, October 24th, 1415, the 2 armies camped within sight of each other. The French camp blazed with campfires, torches, lanterns, a festival of light and sound. Nobles gambled over dice, wagering which English lords they'd capture tomorrow. Heralds moved between contingents, drawing up lists of expected prisoners, negotiating in advance who had rights to which ransoms. Musicians played. Wine flowed freely from barrels brought up by supply wagons. Some knights were literally drunk, celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet. The noise carried across the field to the English position. Laughter, singing, the sound of men who believed tomorrow would bring glory and gold with minimal risk. The English camp was silent. Henry had ordered absolute quiet on pain of mutilation. Any man making unnecessary noise would lose an ear. Soldiers sharpened stakes in the darkness, working by feel more than sight, keeping fires to a minimum. Archers checked their bowstrings, counted arrows, said prayers. Many wrote wills using whatever scraps of parchment they possessed, witnessed by fellow soldiers who would probably die alongside them. Priests moved through the camp hearing confessions, administering last rites to men still alive but certain of death tomorrow. The dysentery continued its work. Men couldn't control their bowels anymore, shitting where they lay, too weak and sick to care about dignity. Some were delirious with fever, calling for mothers, wives, God, anyone who might save them from what was coming. The contrast between the two camps told the entire story before a single blow was struck. The French had everything: numbers, position, equipment, confidence, supplies, reinforcements available if needed. The English had nothing except desperation, longbows, and a king who believed God had personally ordained his victory. On paper, there was no battle here, just an execution waiting to happen. The French would grant honourable deaths to the English nobles, ransoms for those worth taking alive, and quick ends for the common soldiers, everything according to the proper forms and customs, chivalric warfare at its finest. That was the plan. They were about to learn that plans meant nothing when you faced men with nothing left to lose. Henry V woke before dawn on October 25th with a fever that made his vision swim. He'd been sick since Harfleur, not dysentery like his men, but something that burned through him in waves, leaving him shaking and weak between bouts. His physicians had no idea what infected him. Didn't matter. He forced himself upright, dressed in armour that seemed heavier each day, and walked through the camp while darkness still covered the field. Men watched him pass in silence, faces hollow in the dim light of shielded lanterns. Some were crying, not from fear exactly, beyond that now, but from the simple exhaustion of being this close to death for this long. The original plan had been brilliant. Land at Harfleur, take the city in days, march through Normandy, capturing towns, establish a base of operations, force France to negotiate from weakness. Henry would prove England still possessed the military capability to contest France's territories, reassert the Plantagenet claimed French lands, maybe even the French crown itself. His great-grandfather Edward III had won spectacular victories. His grandfather, the Black Prince, had ravaged France for decades. Henry believed destiny and divine right ran in his bloodline. God had ordained the English king's claim to France. Simple, absolute, unquestionable. Harfleur destroyed everything. The city resisted far longer than intelligence reports suggested. French reinforcements slipped through English siege lines repeatedly, bringing fresh supplies and troops. Every assault cost dozens of English lives. The siege guns broke down. Gunpowder ran low. Dysentery appeared in the third week, spreading through the besieging army like wildfire through dry grass. Men would be healthy at breakfast and shitting blood by dinner. By the fifth week, the English had lost more men to disease than combat. When Harfleur finally surrendered, Henry's army was finished as an offensive force. He'd had to leave over 2,000 men garrisoning Harfleur, troops too sick to march but still capable of holding walls. That reduced his effective strength to under 6,000 men. His supplies were nearly exhausted. The siege had consumed weeks of rations meant to last months. Winter approached. Storms would make channel crossings dangerous soon, potentially impossible. Every strategic calculation said retreat immediately. Load the army onto ships, return to England, declare Harfleur a victory and Normandy secured. Spin the invasion as successful despite accomplishing almost nothing. Minimise losses. Henry refused. Retreating by sea meant admitting defeat, confirming every French noble's opinion that England was finished as a continental power. His own nobility would question his competence. Parliament would refuse to fund future campaigns. The French would press their advantage, maybe even launch their own invasion of England. Everything his dynasty had built for 3 generations would collapse. Worse, much worse for Henry personally, it would prove God didn't favour his claim. Henry was devoutly religious to the point of fanaticism. He attended Mass daily, prayed for hours, consulted priests on every major decision. His invasion of France wasn't political ambition, it was holy mission. God wanted him to reclaim his rightful inheritance. Divine providence would ensure victory. So he chose the march. 150 miles to Calais with an army that could barely stand. The decision shocked his own commanders, men who'd fought in France for decades and understood the logistics of medieval warfare. Marching that distance through enemy territory required supplies, fresh troops, secure supply lines, defended stopping points. Henry had none of those things. He had dysentery-ravaged soldiers, dwindling food stocks, hostile territory, and absolute faith that God would provide. His commanders protested. Henry ordered them silent. The march would proceed. The first week went exactly as poorly as expected. French cavalry harassed the column constantly, never committing to actual combat, just wearing down the English through constant alertness and minor skirmishes. Sleep became impossible. Every night brought alarms, false attacks, scouts probing the English camp. Men collapsed from exhaustion while marching. Those who fell behind were captured or killed by French patrols. The army shed soldiers daily like a snake shedding skin. Henry ordered that any man who couldn't keep pace would be left behind. Harsh, but necessary. The entire army would collapse if they slowed to accommodate the weakest. Food ran out completely by the 5th day. The English were marching through Norman countryside already harvested for winter. French forces had cleared every village along their route, burned grain stores, driven off livestock, poisoned wells. Deliberate scorched earth tactics designed to starve the invaders without risking battle. It worked. English soldiers ate whatever they could forage. Acorns, tree bark, grass, roots dug from frozen ground. Some killed and ate their horses, which solved the food problem temporarily, but eliminated their few remaining cavalry. Officers tried to maintain discipline as their men deteriorated into a shambling mob of walking corpses. The Somme River should have been crossable at multiple points. The French had destroyed or blocked every bridge, garrisoned every ford, turned the river into an impassable barrier. Henry marched his army upstream for 6 days, searching for any crossing point the French hadn't covered. His men were literally dying of starvation now. Soldiers would collapse during the march and simply not get up again, dead from hunger and disease combined. The smell of the English column was overwhelming. Thousands of men with dysentery produce a stench that lingered in the air for miles, a sweet rotten odour that attracted carrion birds and flocks. French forces on the opposite bank made a show of eating in view of the English. They'd haul out bread, meat, wine, cheese, a feast spread on tables just across the river, close enough for the starving English to smell cooking food. Some French nobles treated it as a joke, a bit of psychological warfare mixed with entertainment. They'd drink toasts to the English king's health, wave cups of wine at Henry's position, laugh at men too weak to respond. A few English archers tried shooting at them, but the range was too great and their weakened muscles couldn't pull their bows to full draw. The arrows fell short. The French laughed harder. The crossing at Agincourt was barely a ford, more like a place where the river ran slightly shallower than elsewhere. The water still reached chest height on most men. Current ran swift enough to sweep away anyone who stumbled. The French hadn't bothered defending it because they assumed no army in the English condition could manage such a difficult crossing under fire. They miscalculated. English archers provided covering volleys while men-at-arms waded into freezing water, holding weapons and armour above their heads, struggling against current that tried to drag them downstream. Men did drown, swept away to disappear beneath brown water. Bodies never recovered. But most made it across through sheer desperate determination. The crossing took an entire day. By the time the last English soldiers reached the north bank, they were in worse condition than before, soaked, freezing, exhausted beyond anything they'd previously experienced. Some men were hypothermic, shaking so violently they couldn't hold their weapons. Henry ordered fires built immediately. Consequences be damned. His army would die of cold before the French killed them if they didn't warm up. The smoke gave away their position perfectly. Didn't matter anymore. The French knew exactly where they were and what condition they were in. The crossing had bought the English perhaps 2 days' head start toward Calais. Nothing more. French scouts reported the English movements hourly. The Dauphin issued orders to every noble contingent within range: assemble at Agincourt, block the Calais road, end this. The response exceeded expectations. Nobles who'd been planning to sit out the campaigns suddenly rode to join the muster. Nobody wanted to miss the glory of destroying an English army and possibly capturing their king. Henry V as a prisoner would be worth a fortune beyond imagination. Tens of thousands of pounds in ransom, enough to fund a noble household for generations. Beyond money, the prestige of capturing an enemy king would elevate any noble's family permanently. Knights rode through the night to reach Agincourt, pushing their horses to exhaustion, terrified they'd miss the battle. The French army assembled piecemeal, each contingent arriving independently, setting up separate camps, maintaining their own supply trains and command structures. No unified command existed. 3 dukes of royal blood each claimed authority. Dozens of counts and barons commanded their own forces. Hundreds of knights owed allegiance to different lords. The army was less a coordinated force than a collection of private military companies all nominally fighting for France. In theory, this created problems. In practice, against an enemy as weak as the English, it didn't matter. They had such overwhelming numerical superiority that coordination was unnecessary. Just march forward and the English would collapse. By October 24th, the French force exceeded 30,000 men. Some estimates ran higher, 40,000, maybe 50,000. Exact counts were impossible when each noble maintained private records. The English numbered perhaps 6,000, probably fewer after the crossing and continued desertions. 5-to-1 odds minimum, possibly 8-to-1. The French had thousands of fully armoured knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, crossbowmen, professional infantry, supplies for weeks, reinforcements available if needed. The English had longbowmen, desperation, and a sick king who believed God would save him. We hope you've already subscribed to our channel, and if not, please do so right now. Our goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. This is very important to us. Only on our channel will you find such interesting and unique stories about history. Subscribe so you don't miss them, and we'll get back to the story. The position near Agincourt was perfect for the French. Open field flanked by woods on both sides, forcing the English into a narrow front where their smaller numbers would be even more disadvantaged. The road to Calais ran straight through French lines. Henry couldn't avoid battle without abandoning his entire campaign objective. The ground was recently ploughed, churned muddy by rain over the previous week. Heavy cavalry would have difficulty, but the French planned to fight mostly dismounted anyway. Their nobles would advance on foot in full armour, unstoppable heavy infantry that would simply walk through English arrows and crush their line through weight and numbers. That night, French nobles calculated their expected ransoms. Heralds moved between camps with lists of English lords, their estimated worth, which French nobles had first claimed based on rank and position. Arguments erupted over precedence. Who would capture the king? Who got the royal dukes? Who had rights to lesser nobility? Some nobles gambled their anticipated ransoms before the battle even started, so certain of victory they were spending money they hadn't earned yet. Wine flowed until midnight and beyond. The celebration went late because nobody expected to need much sleep. Tomorrow's battle would be over by noon at the latest. The English could hear the French celebration across the field. Every laugh, every shout, every burst of drunken singing carried through the night air to men trying to sleep in cold mud. Henry's order for silence held despite the provocation. English soldiers lay in the darkness listening to their enemy party, knowing those same Frenchmen would be trying to kill them in the morning. Some prayed, others sharpened weapons they'd already sharpened a dozen times, just to have something to do with their hands. A few wrote letters that would never be delivered, final messages to families they'd never see again. Henry knelt in his tent praying until his knees bled through his trousers. His fever had worsened. He was definitely sick with something beyond simple exhaustion. Every joint ached. His head pounded with pressure that made thinking difficult. But he couldn't show weakness to his men. Tomorrow he'd need to lead them into battle, needed to inspire troops who had every reason to believe they were marching to their deaths. He prayed for strength, for victory, for confirmation that God truly did favour England's cause. The response he received, or believed he received, the line between divine inspiration and fever dream being unclear, was absolute certainty. God would deliver victory. The righteous would triumph. France would fall. Just before dawn, Henry emerged from his tent and walked through the camp one final time. His presence steadied men on the edge of collapse. Here was their king, sick and exhausted as they were, preparing to fight beside them rather than negotiating safe surrender. Some soldiers reached out to touch his armour as he passed, seeking reassurance or blessing or simply human connection before they died. Henry stopped occasionally to speak with common soldiers, brief words, nothing elaborate, just acknowledgement that they were here, they were English, they would fight. The conversations would later become legend, embellished into grand speeches. In reality, they were short exchanges between exhausted men facing impossible odds. Dawn broke cold and grey. The French army assembled in plain view across the field, their numbers so vast they seemed to fill the entire landscape. English soldiers could see the forest of flags and banners marking noble contingents, the glint of sunlight on thousands of armour sets, horses being walked in preparation for mounted units. The visual was designed to intimidate. Look at our strength. See your inevitable defeat. Surrender now before we destroy you. Some English soldiers did desert in those final minutes, slipping away into the woods, choosing the slim chance of escaping through hostile territory over the certainty of death in battle. Henry didn't stop them. Anyone lacking the will to fight would break at first contact anyway. The army stood ready. The battle should have started immediately. It didn't. The French waited. They had no need to attack. The English position was impossible. Supplies were exhausted. Disease continued killing men hourly. Time favoured France completely. Every hour the battle was delayed, the English grew weaker. The smart play was to simply stand there and watch the English army fall apart on its own. Then the French could advance and accept surrender from men too weak to resist. Minimum casualties, maximum prisoners, maximum ransoms. Perfect victory. 4 hours passed. The armies just stood there. English soldiers began collapsing from exhaustion, literally falling asleep standing in formation. Some men died during those hours, succumbed to disease or starvation while waiting to die in battle instead. The absurdity was complete. Henry realized the French wouldn't attack. His army would simply dissolve where it stood. After everything, the invasion, the siege, the march, the starvation, the river crossing, reaching this field, his men would die without ever fighting because the French were too smart to give them the battle they needed. Henry made a decision that was either brilliant or insane. He ordered the advance. The English army would move forward, get within bowshot of the French and force them to attack. It violated every principle of medieval warfare. You didn't advance toward a vastly superior enemy. You held position and made them come to you. But Henry understood something the French nobles didn't. His army was dying right now, this moment, without the French doing anything. Battle was the only chance for survival, even if that survival required killing thousands of Frenchmen first. He gave the order. The English army moved forward. The English advance covered 250 yards in absolute silence, except for the squelch of boots in mud and the rasp of sick men breathing. Each archer carried a sharpened wooden stake 6 feet long, pointed at both ends, their primary defence against cavalry charges. These stakes had been cut from Norman forest during the march, carried for days by men who could barely walk, planted and pulled up and replanted at every stop. Now they'd serve their purpose, or the men carrying them would die uselessly. The weight of those stakes felt immense after weeks of starvation. Some archers had carved theirs thinner just to reduce the burden, which defeated the entire purpose but kept them from collapsing. French nobles watched the advance with confusion turning to delight. The English were walking toward them, advancing into the open field where French cavalry could flank and destroy them. Henry had apparently lost his mind completely, abandoning his defensive position for no tactical reason anyone could determine. French commanders shouted orders to prepare for attack. The English had just handed them an even easier victory than expected. Knights mounted horses, infantry tightened formations, crossbowmen moved to forward positions. The trap was closing and the English were walking into it voluntarily. Henry stopped his army exactly 250 yards from the French line, maximum effective range for English longbows. The archers planted their stakes in ground already soft from rain, and churned by thousands of French feet during their assembly. Each stake was angled forward at chest height, creating a barrier that would impale any horse stupid enough to charge into it. The planting took minutes, vulnerable minutes when the French could have charged and caught the English in chaos. They didn't. French nobles were still organising their formations, arguing about who would have the honour of leading the attack, adjusting armour and checking weapons. The delay gave English archers time to prepare. Then the arrow storm began. 5,000 longbowmen shooting in rotating volleys produced roughly 10,000 arrows per minute filling the air. The sound was like cloth tearing amplified until it drowned out everything else, a continuous ripping noise that made speech impossible and thinking difficult. Each arrow was a cloth-yard shaft, 3 feet long, tipped with steel bodkin points designed to punch through armour. At 250 yards, the arrows arced high, came down nearly vertical, hit with enough force to penetrate 3 inches into solid wood. The sky literally darkened with arrows. French soldiers looked up and saw death falling like black rain. French cavalry on both flanks reacted first. Mounted knights were supposed to counter archers, charge through the arrow storm and break the enemy line before the arrows could do serious damage. Theory said horses were brave and well trained, that knights in armour were nearly invulnerable to arrows, that a proper cavalry charge was unstoppable. The reality was different. A warhorse with an arrow in its eye doesn't charge forward bravely. It panics, screams, rears and bolts sideways into other horses. One panicked horse creates chaos in tight formation. 10 panicked horses create a cascading disaster. The French cavalry charge collapsed before it properly began. Horses were hit first. They presented larger targets than armoured riders, and their heads were exposed even when riders were fully protected. Arrows struck eyes, nostrils, mouths, the soft flesh of throats and bellies. A horse hit in multiple places doesn't understand discipline or training. It responds to pain with blind animal panic. The charge turned into a stampede of wounded, terrified animals running in every direction except forward. Knights tried controlling their mounts and failed. Some were thrown when their horses reared. Others clung to saddles while their mounts galloped away from battle entirely. The cavalry that did reach the English line hit the wooden stakes. 6-foot stakes planted at angles don't stop a charging horse cleanly, they impale it. The impact drove stakes through horse chests, the momentum carrying horses forward even as they died, stakes punching through their bodies and emerging bloody from their backs. Dying horses crashed into other horses behind them. The charge compressed into a writhing mass of screaming animals, fallen riders, and stakes slick with blood and intestines. Some French knights were crushed beneath their own dying horses. Others staggered to their feet in full armour and tried walking back to French lines through continuing arrow volleys. Wounded horses from the failed charges bolted back toward French formations. Animals in pain don't avoid their own lines. They run toward anything familiar, seeking safety that doesn't exist. Panicked war horses crashed through the ranks of French infantry, preparing to advance, trampling men, creating gaps in formations, spreading chaos through collisions that knocked armoured soldiers into mud. The French main body hadn't even started advancing yet, and their formations were already disrupted by their own cavalry. French commanders ordered the main advance. Thousands of dismounted knights began marching forward. This was supposed to be France's trump card. Heavy infantry in full plate armour, virtually impenetrable, armed with swords and polearms, trained from childhood for exactly this type of combat. They'd simply walk through the arrow storm, reach the English line, and crush the lighter armoured English through superior protection and close combat skill. The plan was sound. The execution became a nightmare almost immediately. The field between the armies wasn't just muddy. It was recently ploughed and soaked by a week of rain. Each step churned the ground deeper. Heavy French armour turned advantageous protection into a liability. 70 pounds of steel plate on a man's body drives his feet deep into soft earth with every step. The mud sucked at boots, required conscious effort to extract each foot, turned walking into exhausting labour. French knights found themselves struggling against the ground itself before they'd covered 50 yards. The arrow storm never stopped. 10,000 arrows per minute meant constant incoming impacts. Individual arrows couldn't penetrate plate armour at the chest or back. The French were right about that. But armour has gaps. Joints need flexibility to allow movement, which means less protection. The back of the knee had minimal coverage. The armpit was exposed when arms were raised. The groin required gaps for mobility. The visor had slits for vision. Skilled archers didn't aim at armoured torsos. They aimed for the gaps. A man in full armour with an arrow through his knee joint doesn't walk. He collapses and can't get back up under 70 pounds of steel. Men began falling. The French advance slowed as soldiers instinctively crowded together for mutual protection, which made them easier targets and worsened the mud problem. More boots churning the same ground turned the field into a quagmire. The advance that should have taken minutes was taking tens of minutes, all while under continuous arrow bombardment. Knights at the front were exhausted before they even reached the English line, having marched 300 yards through deepening mud while carrying massive weight and being shot at the entire time. The second line of French forces pushed forward, adding their weight to the advance. This should have helped. More men, more momentum, more force hitting the English position. Instead, it made everything worse. The second line pressed against the first line's backs, forcing front-rank knights forward into mud they couldn't escape. Men who stumbled and fell couldn't get back up because soldiers behind them were pushing forward, stepping on them, driving them face down into mud. The French advance became a slow-motion crush, where the rear ranks were inadvertently killing their own front ranks through pressure. English archers watched the French struggle across the field and adjusted their tactics. They stopped shooting at individual targets and started shooting into masses of compressed French infantry. Impossible to miss when enemy soldiers were packed so tightly they couldn't raise their arms. Arrows found gaps, joints, exposed flesh. Men at the front of the French formation were taking multiple hits. An arrow through the knee, another through the armpit, a third through the groin, dying slowly from accumulating wounds while unable to retreat because thousands of men behind them kept pushing forward. The French flanks were being destroyed simultaneously with the main advance. Woods on both sides of the field channeled the entire French army into a narrow front, exactly as Henry had planned when choosing to fight here. French numbers became irrelevant. Only the front ranks could engage, while thousands of soldiers behind them stood uselessly waiting their turn. The woods also hid English archers who'd positioned themselves on the flanks, shooting into the sides of the French formation where armour protection was weakest. French knights were taking arrows from 3 directions, front, left, right, with no way to defend against all of them simultaneously. Some French knights reached the English line after what felt like hours, but was perhaps 20 minutes. They were exhausted from the march, had taken multiple arrow hits in gaps and joints, were struggling to breathe inside closed helmets fogged with their own breath, but they were still alive and still fighting. This should have been the moment where French superiority in close combat paid off. Armoured knights against lightly armoured archers, experience and training against peasant soldiers, noble warriors against common rabble, the French attacked. The English didn't fight chivalrously. Archers dropped their bows and picked up mallets, axes, swords, whatever weapons they'd scavenged or stolen during the campaign. They attacked French flanks while men-at-arms held the centre. No honour, no individual duels, just brutal killing focused on efficiency over glory. A French knight in full armour is nearly invulnerable from the front. From the side or behind there are gaps. English soldiers worked in groups. One man would engage a French knight's attention while others attacked from behind, hammering at knee joints, armpits, the back of the neck where armour was thinner. French knights couldn't manoeuvre. The mud held them in place like tar. Fighting required planting your feet and swinging, but feet planted in 18 inches of mud couldn't shift position quickly. English soldiers were lighter, more mobile in the terrible conditions, able to dodge around French attacks and strike from unexpected angles. The advantage French armour should have provided was negated by terrain that prevented the mobility necessary to use that armour effectively. The second French line crashed into the first, adding weight, but no additional combat effectiveness. Knights at the front were now compressed so tightly they couldn't swing their weapons properly. Arms were pinned against bodies by pressure from behind. Some men were being crushed slowly, ribs cracking under the combined weight of their own armour and the pressure of hundreds of men behind them trying to push forward into combat. The French advance had become a human avalanche moving in slow motion, grinding its own front ranks into paste against the English position. Men at the front began suffocating. Visors closed for protection meant breathing through narrow slits. Exertion from fighting increased oxygen needs. The press of bodies from behind meant no air circulation. Some knights were simply asphyxiating inside their armour, dying from lack of oxygen while technically uninjured by enemy weapons. Others died from being pushed face down into mud and held there by the weight of bodies falling on top of them. They drowned in inches of muddy water, unable to rise, unable even to turn their heads to breathe. The pile of bodies grew. Dead and dying French knights created an obstacle that made advancing even harder. The third French line pushed forward, climbing over corpses of their own nobles to reach the enemy, slipping on blood-slick armour, falling into mud that was now mixed with blood and shit and dying men's last breaths. Some wounded French soldiers at the bottom of the pile were being trampled by their own reinforcements, ribs caving in under armoured boots, faces crushed into unrecognisable masses of meat and broken bone. English soldiers began targeting specific weak points with disturbing efficiency. A mallet strike to the side of a helmet didn't need to penetrate armour. The impact would cause concussion, knock the man unconscious, and unconscious men in armour fall down and don't get back up. Daggers thrust through visor slits required precision, but offered guaranteed kills. 6 inches of steel through the eye socket into the brain. Dead instantly. The fighting became mechanical. French knights would stagger up to the English line, already wounded and exhausted, and English soldiers would methodically kill them, using techniques developed through necessity rather than training. The battle had been raging for over an hour, and the French hadn't broken through anywhere. Their overwhelming numerical advantage meant nothing in terrain that prevented them from bringing those numbers to bear effectively. The narrow field funneled them into a killing zone. The mud held them in place. Their own rear ranks pressed forward, crushing their front ranks into an increasingly small space. English arrows continued falling. Archers in the rear were shooting high arcs over their own lines, raining arrows down on French forces still trying to advance through the carnage. French commanders at the rear finally understood what was happening. This wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. Their finest knights were dying by hundreds, maybe thousands, achieving nothing except adding to the pile of corpses. Orders went out to halt the advance, pull back, reassess. But orders couldn't penetrate the chaos. Knights at the front couldn't retreat because soldiers behind them were still pushing forward. Communication was impossible through the noise of combat and the closed helmets that isolated each man in his own personal metal prison. The French advance continued because nobody at the front could stop it even after the commanders had decided to. Some French soldiers at the rear broke and ran. These men could see what was happening, understood the advance had failed, recognized that continuing forward meant certain death for uncertain purpose. They fled the field entirely, abandoning their lords and their duty and their honour to save their own lives. French commanders tried stopping the desertions and couldn't. Men scattered into the woods, threw away their identifying colours, disappeared into the countryside. The army was collapsing from the rear while still fighting at the front, simultaneous advance and retreat creating chaos that destroyed any possibility of coordinated response. The English line held, barely. Some sections were being pressed back by sheer weight of French numbers, but held. English casualties were mounting, men-at-arms falling to French swords, archers caught in close combat and killed. But for every Englishman who died, 10 Frenchmen had fallen. The arithmetic was brutal and simple. France had more men but was losing them at a rate that would exhaust their army before it exhausted England's. Henry fought in the thick of the melee, his royal status abandoned for the necessity of personal combat. His armour took multiple hits, dents from sword strikes, a piece of his crown knocked off by an axe that nearly split his skull. He killed men personally, swinging a battle axe with manic energy fueled by fever and religious conviction. His presence steadied the English line repeatedly. Soldiers saw their king fighting beside them and found strength they didn't know they possessed. The image of a dying king personally killing French nobles became the battle's defining symbol. The fighting continued into its 3rd hour. French bodies were piled higher than a man's head in some places. Blood had turned the mud completely red, a slick that made footing impossible and fighting nightmarish. Some men were sliding and falling constantly, unable to maintain balance on ground coated with blood and liquefied flesh. The smell was beyond description. Opened bodies, released bowels, blood cooking in morning sun, thousands of men who'd been marching and fighting in the same clothes for weeks. Soldiers were vomiting inside their helmets and continuing to fight because stopping meant death. Then the French broke. No specific moment caused it, just accumulated horror finally overwhelming the army's ability to continue. Knights turned and fled, stumbling back through the mud they'd crossed, abandoning their advance, their wounded, their dead, their honour. Once the rout started, it spread like fire. Entire formations dissolved as men realized they could escape, that death wasn't inevitable if they just ran. The proud French army that had outnumbered the English 5-1 was fleeing the field in complete disorder. English soldiers didn't pursue. They were too exhausted. Some collapsed where they stood, legs giving out from the sustained effort of combat. Others leaned on their weapons, gasping for air, unable to believe they were still alive. The field between the armies was carpeted with French dead and wounded, thousands of bodies in armour now worth a fortune in ransoms. English soldiers began moving through the carnage, checking bodies, securing prisoners, and stripping armour from the dead. The battle was over. France had lost everything, and the killing hadn't even finished yet. The morning of October 25th had begun with absolute French confidence bordering on delusion. Noble commanders gathered at dawn to finalise arrangements that had nothing to do with military tactics, and everything to do with dividing anticipated spoils. The battle plan, such as it existed, was discussed less than the ransom schedule. French heralds had prepared documents listing every English noble by rank and estimated value, complete with notes on which French lord had first claim based on position in the line. Arguments erupted over precedents that would have been comical if thousands of lives didn't depend on the outcome. The field itself seemed designed for French victory. 900 yards long, perhaps 750 yards wide at the narrowest point, flanked by dense woods on both sides. The Tramecourt woods on the left, Agincourt woods on the right, thick forest that would prevent any flanking manoeuvres and channel both armies into a direct confrontation. Recent ploughing had left the ground soft, but not impossibly so by medieval standards. Rain over the previous week had soaked the earth thoroughly, creating conditions that cavalry found difficult but infantry could manage. The French saw terrain that would prevent clever English tactics and force straightforward battle where superior numbers would dominate. French forces assembled in 3 massive divisions. The vanguard consisted entirely of dismounted knights and men-at-arms, perhaps 8,000 men in full plate armour forming the first line. These weren't common soldiers. They were nobles, trained warriors from childhood, equipped with the finest military technology Europe had produced. Each suit of armour represented months of skilled craftsman's labour, custom fitted to the wearer, worth more than a peasant farmer earned in a lifetime. The armour worked. Plate steel properly made could stop crossbow bolts at close range, turn sword strikes, render the wearer nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Behind the vanguard stood the main battle, another 6,000 armoured knights and nobles forming the second line. Their role was to exploit whatever breakthrough the vanguard achieved, push through any gaps in the English position, and complete the destruction of enemy forces. Standard medieval battle doctrine, proven in countless engagements across Europe. The third line consisted of mounted knights, roughly 8,000 cavalry held in reserve for pursuit once the English broke. Additional forces included several thousand crossbowmen, infantry support, and various retainers attached to noble households. Total strength probably exceeded 30,000 men, possibly reaching 40,000 depending on which noble contingents are counted. The organisational structure was feudal chaos. Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, nominally commanded the army but held no real authority to issue binding orders. The Dukes of Orléans, Bourbon, and Alençon each commanded substantial independent forces and answered to no one except the Mad King in Paris. Below them, 90 counts and senior nobles led their own contingents, followed by over 1,500 knights commanding smaller household troops. Every commander wanted personal glory. Nobody wanted to follow someone else's orders. The army resembled a collection of private military companies that happened to be fighting the same enemy rather than a unified force operating under central command. This lack of coordination would have destroyed a lesser army. Against the English, French nobles assumed it didn't matter. They had such overwhelming numerical and qualitative superiority that tactics were almost irrelevant. Just march forward, use armour and training to close with the enemy, and crush them through weight of numbers and superior close combat skills. The English would have perhaps 1,000 armoured men-at-arms capable of fighting French knights on equal terms. The remaining 5,000 were archers, peasants with bows, completely ineffective once French knights reached their position. Simple arithmetic made victory inevitable. The positioning of crossbowmen revealed French assumptions about the battle. Several thousand crossbowmen were present but placed behind the main fighting lines, where they'd be largely useless once melee combat began. Their role was suppressing English archers during the advance, nothing more. French commanders considered crossbowmen hired help, professionals doing a job but not real warriors in the chivalric sense. Using them effectively would require coordinating their fire with the armoured advance, something that demanded unified command and careful planning. Neither existed. The crossbowmen would shoot when they felt like it, from wherever they happened to be standing, with no particular coordination with anyone else. French cavalry positioned on both flanks was supposed to charge simultaneously with the infantry advance, hit the English archers before they could establish proper defensive positions, and break their line before the main battle even began. The cavalry numbered around 1,200 on each flank, 2,400 mounted knights total, more than enough to overwhelm 5,000 archers if they could reach them. Each knight rode a warhorse worth a small fortune, trained for combat, capable of trampling men on foot. The horses wore their own armour, steel plates covering head and chest, leather protection on flanks. A proper cavalry charge was supposed to be unstoppable, especially against infantry caught in the open. The plan required coordination that didn't exist. Cavalry would charge when their commanders decided, not when it would best support the infantry advance. The vanguard would march when its nobles were ready, regardless of what cavalry was doing. The second line would advance when it felt appropriate, which might be immediately behind the first line, or might be after a significant delay depending on how individual commanders interpreted the situation. The third line, mounted reserves, would wait for orders that might never come because no unified command structure existed to issue them. Arguments about honour consumed hours that should have been spent on tactical preparation. French nobles fought for the privilege of serving in the vanguard, the position of greatest danger and therefore greatest glory. Lesser nobles were furious at being assigned to rear positions where they might not see combat at all. The Constable d'Albret tried maintaining some reasonable organisation and was largely ignored by nobles who outranked him socially if not militarily. The Duke of Orléans wanted overall command based on his royal blood. The Duke of Bourbon disagreed, citing his own royal connections and superior military experience. Nobody won these arguments, they just consumed time while the English watched and prepared. The decision to fight dismounted revealed how thoroughly French military doctrine had failed to adapt to reality. 50 years earlier at Crécy, French cavalry had charged English archers and been destroyed. Horses killed by arrow storms, knights left stranded on foot in enemy territory. 20 years after that at Poitiers, mounted French knights were slaughtered again by English longbowmen. Every major French defeat in the 100 Years' War followed the same pattern. French cavalry charging English archers, horses panicking under arrow bombardment, French knights losing mobility and being killed or captured. The lesson was obvious. Don't charge English archers with cavalry. The French learned the wrong lesson. Instead of developing tactics to counter longbows, they decided cavalry was obsolete and switched to dismounted heavy infantry. This solved the horse problem but created new ones. Knights on foot lost mobility and became vulnerable to exactly the kind of terrain problems that would destroy them at Agincourt. but French military theorists convinced themselves that armour technology had advanced enough to render arrows irrelevant. Modern plate armour could stop arrows. Therefore archers were no longer a serious threat. Therefore charging them on foot while protected by armour would work perfectly. This confidence in armour's protective qualities wasn't entirely unjustified. Plate steel tested against longbows at realistic battle ranges did stop most arrows, at least at the torso where armour was thickest. French knights had shot their own armour with crossbows, and English longbows captured at previous battles verified that arrows couldn't penetrate at the chest. What they hadn't tested adequately was arrows hitting joints, gaps, the small exposed areas that armour couldn't fully protect without preventing movement entirely. They hadn't considered what happens when thousands of arrows hit thousands of targets simultaneously. Statistical certainty that some arrows would find gaps even if most didn't. The French plan's greatest weakness was that it wasn't really a plan. It was an assumption that superior numbers and equipment would automatically produce victory without requiring actual tactical thought. March forward in overwhelming strength, trust armour to protect against arrows, close to melee range where French superiority in close combat would dominate. Everything after that was improvisation based on battlefield conditions. This approach had worked against other European armies composed of similar forces using similar tactics. Against the English, it had failed repeatedly. French commanders assumed previous failures resulted from bad luck or incompetent leadership, not fundamental flaws in their approach. The attitude toward English soldiers revealed the depth of French delusion. French nobles genuinely believed English archers were peasant rabble, beneath contempt as warriors. Archery required strength and practice, but not noble birth or chivalric training. Therefore archers weren't real soldiers in the sense that mattered. They were tools, like siege equipment or pack animals, useful in their limited capacity but not worthy opponents. French knights expected to walk through arrow fire, reach the archers and butcher them like livestock. The English men-at-arms would receive honourable treatment as fellow nobles, but the archers deserved nothing except death. This contempt extended to Henry V personally. French nobles mocked the English king as a boy playing at war, barely 28 years old, leading his first major campaign and obviously botching it badly. His decision to march from Harfleur to Calais was seen as either stupidity or desperation, possibly both. A competent commander would have retreated by sea after Harfleur fell. Henry had chosen the march and destroyed his own army in the process, delivering himself into French hands without the French having to do much except block his path and wait. The battle at Agincourt was seen less as military necessity than formal execution of a campaign already decided by Henry's incompetence. Morning preparations took hours because French nobles refused to be rushed. Armour had to be donned properly, a process requiring assistance from squires and taking significant time when done correctly. Weapons needed blessing from priests travelling with the army. Horses required careful preparation for the cavalry units. Standards and banners had to be displayed prominently so everyone knew which lords were present. Personal appearance mattered enormously. Nobles wanted to look magnificent when capturing the English king, wanted to be remembered in songs and chronicles as exemplars of chivalric virtue. Function mattered less than form. The crossbowmen waited in position and accomplished nothing useful. They'd been placed poorly, couldn't get clear shots at English positions, and weren't receiving orders from anyone. Some shot arrows at the English line from too great a range, wasting ammunition on volleys that fell short or struck harmlessly. Others saved their ammunition for later phases of battle that would never arrive. A few abandoned their positions entirely, deciding that the French didn't need crossbow support for a battle this one-sided. Their absence wouldn't be noticed until it mattered, and by then the battle would be decided. The delay worked entirely in England's favour. Every hour the French spent arguing about precedence and adjusting armour was an hour English soldiers used to rest, eat what little food they had, and prepare defensive positions. The wooden stakes were planted firmly. Archers checked their bowstrings, counted arrows, arranged them point down in the ground for quick access during rapid shooting. Men-at-arms identified weak points in the French formation, gaps between contingents, places where coordination seemed poorest. Henry walked the line repeatedly, showing himself to his troops, projecting confidence he probably didn't feel. French scouts reported English movements and were ignored. The English army advancing closer to French positions should have prompted immediate action, either a counter-advance or defensive preparations. French commanders barely reacted. The English were walking into better killing range. Excellent. That would make the battle shorter. No urgency existed because the outcome was predetermined. The English would be destroyed today. The only question was how long it would take and how the glory would be distributed among the French nobility. The moment the English stopped and planted their stakes should have triggered immediate French response. The stakes indicated defensive positions, meaning the English planned to receive a charge rather than advance further. French cavalry should have attacked instantly, before the stakes were fully set, catching the English in vulnerable transition. The vanguard should have advanced immediately to prevent the English from establishing their position. None of this happened. French commanders watched the English prepare their defence and did nothing because they were still arguing about the order of battle and who would have the honour of fighting where. The first English arrows fell before French forces had finished assembling. This was militarily insignificant. The range was too great for the arrows to do real damage, and French armour stopped them easily at that distance. But it was humiliating. Peasant archers were shooting at French nobles, committing the enormous presumption of attacking their social superiors. Some French knights demanded immediate advance just to punish English insolence. Others insisted on maintaining formation until properly ordered. More argument, more delay, more English arrows falling. Finally the cavalry charged, not because someone ordered it, but because the knights on the flanks couldn't tolerate English arrows falling near them anymore. Honour demanded response. Chivalry required action. The charge began raggedly, different contingents starting at different times, no coordination between the two flanks. It should have been a thundering simultaneous assault from both sides. Instead, it was a rolling attack that started with a few dozen knights and gradually built as others joined, giving the English archers time to concentrate fire on early attackers. The vanguard began its advance slightly after the cavalry charged, not as coordinated support, but because they were finally ready to move. 8,000 armoured knights stepped forward into mud that immediately revealed itself as far worse than expected. The overnight rain had seemed light, but it had soaked ground already loosened by ploughing. Weight that would have been manageable on firm earth became exhausting in sucking mud. Each step required pulling one's foot free of ground that tried holding it in place. The advance slowed almost immediately. French nobles marched forward believing God favoured them, that their cause was righteous, that armour would protect them and numbers would overwhelm the English. They believed in chivalry, honour, noble blood, divine providence, and French superiority. They were about to discover that belief didn't stop arrows, that honour didn't prevent exhaustion, and that divine providence apparently had decided to favour the English today. The slaughter was about to begin, and they still thought they were marching to certain victory. The English position looked hopeless to anyone with basic military knowledge. Henry had roughly 900 men-at-arms wearing whatever armour they'd managed to keep functional through the campaign. Most suits were damaged, dented from previous skirmishes, missing pieces lost during the march, straps broken and repaired with whatever materials soldiers could scavenge. Some men wore partial armour only, having abandoned heavier pieces during the retreat when weight became unbearable. Against French knights in pristine plate steel, they were outmatched in equipment, training and numbers. The men-at-arms formed the centre of the English line, a thin barrier of battered steel between the French army and total annihilation. The real English strength was 5,000 longbowmen positioned on both flanks of the men-at-arms. These weren't recreational archers or part-time militia. They were professionals who'd trained since childhood, shooting hundreds of arrows daily until their bodies deformed to accommodate the weapon. An English longbowman's skeleton was identifiable centuries later by the specific bone changes caused by repeatedly drawing a 100-pound bow. Left arms thicker than right arms from holding the bow, enlarged left shoulder joints, deformed finger bones from years of releasing the string, spine curvature from the asymmetric stance. These men were living weapons shaped by decades of practice. The longbow itself was a technological marvel disguised as a simple wooden stick, 6 feet tall, made from yew wood carefully selected and seasoned, capable of launching a 3-foot arrow over 300 yards. The draw weight, the force required to pull the string to full draw, exceeded 100 pounds, sometimes reaching 150 pounds for the strongest archers. Modern compound bows used by hunters typically have 50 to 70 pound draw weights and are considered powerful. English war bows were twice that strength, requiring enormous upper body power to use effectively. A trained archer could shoot 12 aimed arrows per minute, maintaining that rate for extended periods. The arrows were purpose-built for penetrating armour. Bodkin points, narrow steel spikes designed to punch through chainmail and find gaps in plate armour. The shafts were yard-long ash or poplar, fletched with goose feathers for stability in flight. Each archer carried 2 sheaves of 24 arrows, 48 total per man. 5,000 archers meant 240,000 arrows available. At 12 arrows per minute per archer, the English could sustain 60,000 arrows per minute for the first 4 minutes before the rate declined as ammunition depleted. The mathematics were staggering. A steel cloud dense enough to darken the sky. Henry's tactical plan was simple because he had no resources for complexity. Force the French to attack across muddy ground toward a defensive position. Channel them between the woods into a narrow killing zone where their numbers couldn't deploy effectively. Destroy them with concentrated arrow fire before they reached the English line. If French forces broke through despite the arrows, hold them with men-at-arms while archers dropped bows and joined the melee with whatever hand weapons they carried. There was no fallback position, no reserve forces, no clever manoeuvre waiting to turn the tide if things went badly. This was everything England had, committed to a single desperate fight. The wooden stakes represented England's only defence against cavalry. Each archer had planted a 6-foot stake angled forward at chest height, point hardened in fire. Horses charging into the stakes would impale themselves, creating a barrier of dying animals that would stop or at least slow a cavalry charge long enough for archers to kill the riders. The stakes worked if cavalry charged directly into them. If French cavalry bypassed the stakes or broke through them, the archers were defenceless. They wore minimal armour, carried no shields, couldn't fight effectively in close combat against armoured knights. The stakes either worked, or everyone died. The 4-hour standoff before battle revealed Henry's desperate situation more clearly than any scout report. His army was literally collapsing from exhaustion, disease and starvation while standing in formation. Men were falling asleep on their feet, swaying in place, some collapsing completely. Dysentery continued its work. Soldiers too weak to step out of line just relieved themselves where they stood, creating a smell that mixed with the stench of unwashed bodies and infected wounds. Some men were openly weeping from exhaustion and fear. Others stared blankly at nothing, minds broken by weeks of suffering. This wasn't an army. It was a mob of dying men held together by discipline, terror, and Henry's personal charisma. The decision to advance toward the French was tactically insane and strategically brilliant. Moving forward violated every defensive principle Henry should have followed. You don't advance toward an enemy that vastly outnumbers you. But staying in position meant watching his army die without fighting. Men were already falling dead from disease and starvation. In another hour, dozens more would collapse. By afternoon, the English wouldn't have an army to command. Battle was the only option because waiting meant certain death through attrition. The advance put English archers within 250 yards of the French line, maximum effective range where arrows would have enough velocity to potentially penetrate armour gaps. Any closer and French cavalry could reach them before they established defensive positions. Any farther and their arrows would lack sufficient force to threaten armoured targets. Henry was threading a needle with armies as thread, gambling that French commanders would react slowly enough for the English to plant stakes and begin shooting before cavalry could charge. The gamble worked because French nobles were still arguing. Those precious minutes while the English planted stakes and prepared to shoot were spent by French commanders debating honour, precedence, and glory instead of attacking an enemy in vulnerable transition. Military competence demanded immediate assault, catch the English while they were planting stakes, unable to defend themselves, formations disrupted. Honour and aristocratic pride demanded maintaining proper form, ensuring the battle proceeded according to chivalric codes, waiting until everyone was ready rather than attacking opportunistically. The first English volleys were psychological warfare as much as physical threat. The arrows at maximum range couldn't penetrate French armour reliably, but they didn't need to. They announced English intent to fight, stripped away French assumptions about peasant archers being too intimidated to shoot at nobles, and forced French commanders to respond. The sound alone was devastating. 10,000 arrows per minute producing a continuous roar like tearing cloth amplified until it drowned thought. French soldiers who'd never experienced English arrow storms were shocked by the sheer volume of incoming projectiles. French cavalry charged because honour demanded it, and because arrows falling near them was intolerable. The charge should have succeeded. 1,200 mounted knights per flank, 2,400 total, against 5,000 archers protected only by wooden stakes. Cavalry breaks infantry. That's what cavalry does. Horses terrify men on foot. Mounted warriors have height advantage, momentum, the ability to simply run down enemy soldiers. The French cavalry were experienced warriors on trained war horses, armed with lances and swords, armoured against arrows. Everything favoured their success. Everything except the horses. War horses are brave and well-trained, but they're still animals driven by instinct and pain response. An arrow in the haunch is painful but survivable. The horse will continue charging despite injury. An arrow in the eye is immediately incapacitating. The horse panics, goes blind, loses all training and discipline. English archers didn't shoot at armoured riders who presented small targets protected by steel. They shot at horses who presented large targets with vulnerable areas: eyes, nostrils, mouths, throats, the soft tissue that no amount of armour could fully protect. The range was perfect for precision shooting, close enough that experienced archers could aim at specific targets rather than shooting into masses, far enough that horses had time to panic and disrupt the charge before reaching the stakes. Arrows hit horses in faces, throats, chests where armour didn't cover. A horse hit in the eye rears immediately, throwing or unseating its rider, turning into an obstacle for horses behind it. One panicked horse disrupts a cavalry formation. 10 create chaos. 50 turn a charge into a stampede. The French cavalry charge collapsed into disaster before crossing half the distance to the English line. Wounded horses bolted in every direction except forward. Some ran back toward French lines, crashing through the infantry preparing to advance. Others ran sideways into woods, branches sweeping riders from saddles, horses becoming hopelessly entangled in undergrowth. A few charged forward and hit the wooden stakes, impaling themselves, dying in screaming agony that spooked nearby horses into panic. The small number that reached the English position were isolated individual knights, easily surrounded and pulled from their saddles by archers working in groups. French knights who survived the charge found themselves on foot in the middle of a battlefield, wearing 70 pounds of armour, surrounded by enemy archers. Some tried fighting their way back to French lines and were killed. Others tried surrendering and were killed anyway. English soldiers had neither the time nor resources to guard prisoners during active combat. A few managed escaping into the woods and would spend days wandering lost in enemy territory before being captured or starving. The cavalry that was supposed to break the English line accomplished nothing except disrupting French infantry about to advance. The vanguard advance began while cavalry disaster was still unfolding. 8,000 French knights started marching through mud that immediately revealed itself as far worse than anticipated. The overnight rain had soaked ground loosened by recent ploughing, creating conditions where every step sank several inches into soft earth. 70-pound armour made each step exponentially harder. The weight drove feet deep into mud that required conscious effort to extract. The advance slowed from a march to a trudge within the first 50 yards. English archers adjusted their targeting as the French closed. No point shooting at armoured torsos. The arrows bounced off or stuck harmlessly in plate steel. Instead, they aimed for legs, feet, joints, gaps where armour couldn't provide full protection without preventing movement. A man in plate armour with an arrow through his foot doesn't walk. He falls. Can't get up under 70 pounds of steel in sucking mud. Becomes an obstacle for men behind him. The French advance began leaving wounded men behind in increasing numbers, each fallen knight creating another obstacle that slowed those still moving forward. The compression began as French forces instinctively moved closer together for mutual protection against arrows. Men crowded together, shields overlapping, trying to minimize exposed areas. This made them easier targets. English archers were shooting into masses where hitting something was guaranteed. The compression also worsened the mud problem. More men churning the same ground turned the field into a quagmire. What had been difficult footing became nearly impossible. Some sections of the advance slowed to a crawl, men taking minutes to cover yards, exhaustion setting in before they'd crossed half the distance. The second French line advanced too quickly, pressing against the backs of the vanguard before the vanguard had space to move forward. This should have provided momentum and support. Instead, it created a slow-motion crush, where rear ranks were inadvertently pushing front ranks into mud they couldn't escape. Men at the front were taking pressure from behind, forcing them forward faster than they could maintain balance, causing them to stumble and fall. Some fell and couldn't rise. The weight of armour combined with pushing from behind meant they were trampled, driven face down into mud, suffocated by their own comrades. The arrow storm never stopped. 60,000 arrows per minute during the first minutes, declining slightly as ammunition depleted but never stopping completely. The sound was continuous. Arrows striking armour produced a metallic rain noise. Impacts on shields sounded like hail. Arrows hitting mud made soft thunking sounds. Arrows finding flesh produced wet tearing noises. Above all this was the roar of the arrows themselves in flight, the tearing cloth sound of thousands of shafts cutting through air simultaneously. French soldiers were being killed by sound as much as steel, the psychological impact of continuous bombardment, breaking morale even among men physically uninjured. Henry watched the French advance and knew he had perhaps 10 minutes before they reached his line. 10 minutes to kill as many as possible with arrows. After that, close combat where French numerical superiority would dominate. His men-at-arms were exhausted, outnumbered at least 8-1, wearing inferior equipment. They'd hold briefly through discipline and desperation, but they'd break eventually. Everything depended on those 10 minutes. Every French knight killed by arrows was one less his men-at-arms would face in melee. Every wound inflicted, every man slowed or stopped, every fallen obstacle creating more obstacles, all of it was buying tiny increments of survival chance. The French were dying by hundreds during their advance, and they kept coming. Training, courage, pride, faith in their armour, belief in French superiority, all of it combined to keep the advance moving forward despite accumulating casualties. Knights at the front could see fallen comrades, could hear screaming wounded, were taking arrow hits themselves. They kept walking toward the English line because that's what knights did. Retreat was unthinkable. Surrender was dishonourable. Victory required reaching the enemy and engaging in close combat, where French training and equipment advantages would finally matter. The moment arrived. French knights reached the English line after an advance that should have taken 3 minutes, but had required 20. They were exhausted from the march, wounded from multiple arrow hits, gasping for breath inside closed helmets, struggling to see through fogged visors, but they were still alive, still armed, still armoured, still vastly outnumbering the English. This was supposed to be the moment when French superiority in close combat paid off, when armour and training crushed the lighter English forces, when the battle's outcome was decided in France's favour. The English had other plans. The first French knights to reach the English line were already dying men who hadn't stopped moving yet. Arrow shafts protruded from knee joints, armpits, gaps in armour where steel plates met. Blood leaked from puncture wounds that hadn't hit anything immediately vital, but would kill through blood loss eventually. These men had walked through hell for 20 minutes to reach their enemy, and now they had to fight while carrying multiple injuries, wearing 70 pounds of armour soaked with their own blood, barely able to see through visors fogged with condensation from their laboured breathing. English men-at-arms met them with weapons designed for practicality rather than honour. Pollexes, 6-foot hafts topped with axe blades, hammerheads and spear points, could do everything a knight needed in close combat. The axe blade could hook behind enemy helmets and wrench heads sideways. The hammer could cave in steel plate through sheer impact force. The spear point could thrust through visor slits. These weren't weapons for chivalric single combat. They were tools for killing armoured men efficiently in the chaos of massed battle. The melee began with a crash of steel on steel that echoed across the field. French knights swung swords and maces against English pollexes and halberds. The fighting should have favoured France. Their knights had superior armour, better training, more experience in this exact type of combat. But they were fighting uphill through mud while exhausted from a 20-minute advance under arrow bombardment. English soldiers were fresher, positioned on slightly higher ground, and fighting with nothing to lose. Desperation made them faster, more aggressive, willing to take risks that properly trained knights would avoid. English archers on the flanks dropped their bows and picked up whatever weapons they'd scavenged during the campaign. Mallets, axes, swords taken from dead French soldiers at previous skirmishes, one-handed hammers designed for driving tent stakes but equally effective at crushing helmets. Even sharpened stakes torn from the ground became weapons. 6 feet of fire-hardened wood with a point could punch through gaps in armour if driven hard enough. The archers attacked French flanks in swarms, 3 or 4 men ganging up on individual knights, hitting from multiple directions simultaneously. The fighting devolved into brutal efficiency, stripped of all chivalric pretension. A French knight would engage an English man-at-arms frontally while archers attacked from behind. Hammer blows to the back of knees would drop the knight. Once down, he couldn't rise under armour's weight in the mud. English soldiers would straddle the fallen knight and drive daggers through visor slits, eye sockets, the gap where helmet met gorget. Death came in seconds. No mercy, no ransoms, just killing, methodical and continuous. The mud became England's greatest ally. French knights planted their feet to swing weapons and found their boots sinking deeper with every step. The ground that had exhausted them during the advance now trapped them during combat. Men tried manoeuvring and couldn't. Their feet were stuck ankle-deep in mud that wouldn't release them. English soldiers were lighter, more mobile despite their exhaustion, able to dodge French attacks and counter from unexpected angles. Weight that should have been advantage became liability. The compression worsened as the second French line pressed forward. Knights at the front were squeezed so tightly they couldn't raise their arms properly. Try swinging a sword when men are packed shoulder to shoulder on both sides of you. Impossible. The combat devolved into shoving matches where men were crushed together, unable to fight effectively, barely able to breathe from the pressure. Some French knights were fighting not against the English, but against their own comrades behind them who were pushing forward, oblivious to the fact that front-rank soldiers needed space to actually use their weapons. Men began dying from the crush itself. Ribs cracked under combined weight of armour and pressure from behind. Knights who fell were immediately trampled by their own forces pushing forward. The fallen couldn't protect themselves, couldn't even raise arms to ward off the boots driving their faces into mud. Some died from suffocation, pressed face down into wet earth with hundreds of pounds of armoured men on top of them. Others died from internal injuries as ribs broke and punctured lungs. The English weren't even killing these men. The French were crushing their own front ranks through sheer weight of numbers. Bodies piled up faster than they could be cleared. Dead and dying French knights created obstacles that made advancing harder. The living had to climb over corpses to reach the English line, scrambling over the bodies of their own nobles, losing balance on blood-slick armour, falling into the pile themselves. Some wounded French soldiers were still alive at the bottom of the pile, trapped under dead men, slowly suffocating or bleeding out, unable to move, unable to call for help through helmets that sealed them in individual metal coffins. English soldiers adapted their tactics as the battle progressed. Stop trying to fight French knights face to face in armoured combat. Instead, use mobility and numbers. Dodge French weapon strikes, let them overextend, then swarm them from behind. 3 English soldiers attacking 1 French knight from different directions would overwhelm superior armour through coordinated assault. 1 man engaged frontally, drawing the knight's attention. A second attacked low, going for knees and legs. The third struck high, targeting the neck, helmet gaps, any place unprotected. The knight would fall eventually, and once down he was dead. The specific techniques for killing armoured men became refined through repetition. A mallet strike to the side of a helmet didn't need to penetrate. The impact would cause concussion, knock the man unconscious or at least dazed. Dazed men couldn't defend themselves. English soldiers would wrestle them down into the mud and drown them, hold the helmet face down in muddy water until struggling stopped. Death by drowning in 3 inches of water while wearing armour you couldn't remove. The technique was efficient, required minimal strength, and worked every time. Daggers through visor slits became the preferred killing method for immobilized knights. The visors had narrow horizontal slits for vision, maybe 1 inch tall and 3 inches wide. An agile fighter could thrust a dagger through that gap into the eye socket and brain. 6 inches of steel angled upward into the skull meant instant death. No struggling, no prolonged combat, just a single precise thrust and move on to the next target. English soldiers were becoming expert at this particular murder technique through constant practice. The 3rd French line, mounted reserves meant to exploit breakthrough and pursue fleeing English, couldn't deploy effectively. The field was too crowded with their own forces. The narrow front between the woods meant no room for cavalry manoeuvres. The mud would bog down horses immediately. Cavalry commanders watched the disaster unfolding and realized they were useless. Some units tried advancing anyway, adding to the crush at the front. Others held position, waiting for orders that would never come because nobody was in actual command of this chaos. French crossbowmen positioned at the rear accomplished nothing. They couldn't shoot into the melee without hitting their own knights. The range was too great for effective fire at specific targets. Most had poor angles due to being positioned badly at the start. A few shot anyway, their bolts arcing over French lines to land uselessly or strike French backs. Some crossbowmen abandoned their positions entirely, recognizing that their continued presence served no purpose. They'd been hired as professionals, not suicidal martyrs. When the battle was clearly lost, they left. Henry fought in the thick of combat, personally killing French knights with a battle axe that became increasingly gore-covered as the fighting continued. His royal status made him a target. French knights tried reaching him specifically, hoping to capture the English king and secure their fortunes. They failed. Henry's bodyguard formed a knot of English men-at-arms around their king, killing anything French that came close. The king himself was fighting like a common soldier, swinging his axe with manic energy fueled by fever and religious conviction that God was granting him victory. A French knight nearly killed Henry with an axe strike that hit his helmet, denting the gold crown attached to it and knocking off a decorative piece. The impact would have split Henry's skull if the helmet hadn't been exceptional quality. As it was, he was staggered, possibly concussed, certainly wounded. He kept fighting, killing the man who'd struck him, moving to the next target, swinging his axe mechanically, endlessly, while blood ran down inside his helmet from a scalp wound he couldn't feel through adrenaline and fever. The pile of bodies at the front reached head height in some places. French knights were literally climbing corpse piles to reach the English, scrambling over dead nobles like children climbing hills, except the hills were made of their friends and relatives and liege lords. Some would reach the top of the pile and be immediately cut down, adding to the height. Others would lose balance on blood-slick armour and fall into the mass of dead and dying men, never to emerge. The pile became a terrain feature, an obstacle that channeled French advances into narrow lanes between corpse heaps. English casualties were mounting, but at sustainable rates. For every English soldier who fell, 10 Frenchmen had died. The mathematics were brutal and clear. France had started with 5-1 numerical superiority, but was losing men at 10-1 rates. The equation was resolving in England's favour through sheer bloody arithmetic. If the killing continued at current rates, the French army would be destroyed before the English collapsed from exhaustion. Some French knights at the rear recognised the disaster unfolding and tried retreating. Impossible. The press of bodies behind them prevented backward movement. They were trapped between their own rear ranks still pushing forward and their own front ranks dying in the English killing zone. Attempting to turn around in full armour while packed tightly with other armoured men couldn't be done. They were stuck, forced to shuffle forward toward combat they no longer wanted, watching their front lines being systematically destroyed. The sounds of battle changed as fighting continued. Early in the melee it had been metal striking metal, shouts and war cries, the clash of arms. Now it was screaming, wounded men dying slowly, trapped soldiers suffocating, panicked knights realizing they couldn't escape. The screaming was continuous, hundreds of voices overlapping, creating a noise that drowned out everything else. Some men were going mad from the sound alone, the psychological horror of hearing that many people dying simultaneously. Wounded French soldiers tried surrendering and were ignored or killed. English troops had no capacity for taking prisoners during active combat. Guarding captives required men who were needed for fighting. Prisoners might rearm themselves if the battle turned. The calculation was simple. Dead Frenchmen can't fight back. Living prisoners might. So wounded French nobles who would normally be worth fortunes in ransoms were being executed where they lay, daggers through throat gaps in their armour, dying while trying to verbally surrender to soldiers who didn't care. The smell became overwhelming as the battle progressed into its second hour. Blood has a distinctive copper smell that becomes nauseating in large quantities. Opened bodies release bowel contents, creating a shit stench mixed with blood. Churned mud added an earth smell. Thousands of men who hadn't bathed in weeks contributed body odour. All of it mixed into an invisible cloud that made breathing difficult and thinking harder. Some soldiers were vomiting inside their helmets from the smell and continuing to fight because stopping meant death. English soldiers were fighting through injuries that should have been incapacitating. Broken fingers from weapon impacts, gashed arms from French swords finding gaps in armour, concussions from mace strikes to helmets. They fought through everything because the alternative was dying. Pain didn't matter, injury didn't matter. Only continuing to kill Frenchmen until the French stopped coming mattered. Medical treatment would happen later, if later existed. Right now, there was only combat. The French advance finally stalled completely. The vanguard was destroyed, the second line was trapped in the crush, the third line couldn't deploy. French commanders at the rear could see what was happening but couldn't control it. No system existed for issuing orders to the front through several thousand men packed too tightly to move. Runners couldn't navigate the press of bodies. Signal flags couldn't be seen through the crowd. The army had become a mob, incapable of coordinated action, fighting and dying independently without direction or purpose. Individual French nobles tried rallying their personal retinues for renewed assaults. Small groups of knights would organise, push forward, hit the English line with concentrated force and be destroyed. The English line bent but didn't break. Every French assault accomplished nothing except adding more bodies to the pile. Some French knights made it through the English front ranks only to find English archers waiting behind with mallets and axes. No glory there. Just being clubbed to death by peasants after surviving the most dangerous part of the battle. The turning point came without announcement or dramatic moment. The French simply stopped attacking. Not because they'd been ordered to stop. No such order existed or could have been delivered. They stopped because men at the front were all dead or wounded. Men in the middle were trapped and couldn't advance. Men at the rear finally realised advancing meant certain death. The attack dissolved into chaotic individual survival attempts as French forces tried extracting themselves from the disaster they'd created. The rout began from the back and spread forward. French soldiers who could move freely, those not trapped in the crush, not yet committed to combat, turned and fled, ran toward their own camps, their horses, anywhere away from the killing ground. Once a few started running, more joined. Then everyone was running except those physically incapable of it. Knights threw away weapons to move faster. Some abandoned armour pieces despite their enormous value. Survival mattered more than equipment or honour, or anything except escaping that field. English forces didn't pursue because they couldn't. Exhaustion had finally caught up. Men were collapsing from fatigue, injuries, the accumulated stress of sustained combat. Some had been fighting continuously for over 2 hours, swinging weapons, dodging attacks, killing, surviving. The human body has limits. They'd reached theirs. English soldiers stood amid the carnage, leaning on weapons, too tired to move, too tired even to celebrate. They'd won. Somehow. Against odds that should have been impossible. The field between the armies was covered in French dead and wounded. Thousands of bodies in armour, some piled so high you couldn't see the ground beneath them. Wounded men screaming for help that wouldn't come. Dying nobles calling for priests to administer last rites. The victorious English army stood and stared at what they'd done, too exhausted for triumph, too shocked for celebration. France's finest army had been destroyed in 3 hours. The killing was over, except it wasn't. The immediate aftermath of the rout was chaos masquerading as victory. English soldiers stumbled through the carnage in a daze, unable to process that they'd survived what should have been certain death. Some sat down in the mud and simply stared at nothing. Others began the grim work of checking bodies, searching for wounded English soldiers among the piles of French dead. The field was covered with perhaps 6,000 French corpses, maybe more, exact counts impossible when bodies were stacked 3 and 4 deep in places. Wounded French nobles began calling out their identities and offering ransoms. This was standard medieval practice. Captured nobility would identify themselves by name and title, state their willingness to pay ransom, and expect honourable treatment. The ransoms were substantial. A duke might be worth £10,000, enough to make a common soldier wealthy for life. Lesser nobles still commanded prices in the hundreds or thousands of pounds. The French wounded represented fortunes distributed across the battlefield, waiting to be collected. English soldiers began the processing, moving through the field, checking which armoured figures were alive, securing their surrender, arranging them in groups under guard. The prisoners accumulated rapidly, hundreds within the first hour, then thousands as English troops worked through the carnage systematically. High-ranking prisoners were identified and separated for special handling. The Duke of Orléans captured alive. The Duke of Bourbon, wounded but survivable. Counts, barons, knights by the hundreds. Each one represented wealth beyond anything common soldiers had imagined possessing. Henry watched his soldiers collect prisoners and recognised a developing problem. His army numbered perhaps 5,000 effectives after casualties. The prisoner count was approaching 2,000 and climbing. Soon he'd have more prisoners than guards. Each prisoner required at least 1 guard, probably more for high-ranking nobles who'd attempt escape. The arithmetic was becoming impossible. 6,000 English soldiers couldn't guard 3,000 French prisoners, while also maintaining combat readiness if French forces regrouped for another attack. French forces were regrouping. Scouts reported that elements of the French Third Line, the mounted reserves who'd never engaged, were assembling behind a hill about a mile from the battlefield. Perhaps 3,000 fresh French troops, cavalry who hadn't participated in the disaster, soldiers from the rear echelons who'd fled early enough to avoid the slaughter. They might attack again. Probably wouldn't. They'd seen what happened to their vanguard and second line. But might. Henry couldn't ignore the possibility. The English position was precarious despite victory. His soldiers were exhausted beyond anything they'd previously experienced, having fought for 3 hours in close combat while already weakened by disease and starvation. They had limited ammunition remaining. Many archers had exhausted their arrow supply during the battle. Medical supplies were non-existent. Food was still scarce. And now they had thousands of prisoners to guard while maintaining defensive readiness against a potential renewed French attack. The baggage train became the trigger for catastrophe. English supply wagons and support personnel were positioned behind the army, guarded by a small force deemed sufficient since nobody expected the French to reach them. A group of French soldiers, either organised raiders or desperate looters, accounts conflict, attacked the baggage train during the main battle's final stages. They killed guards, looted supplies, and scattered before English reinforcements could respond. The damage was minimal, but the implications were serious. French forces were operating behind English lines. Henry received reports of the baggage train attack while watching his soldiers struggle with the growing prisoner population. The combination of threats created an impossible situation. Enemy forces possibly regrouping for a second attack to his front. Enemy raiders operating behind his lines. thousands of prisoners who might rearm themselves if the battle resumed, exhausted soldiers who couldn't fight another major engagement. The victory was dissolving into strategic nightmare. The decision Henry made next would haunt his legacy for centuries. He ordered the prisoners executed, all of them except the highest-ranking nobles who were worth too much to kill. Everyone else, wounded French knights, captured soldiers, nobles of middling rank, were to be killed immediately. The order contradicted every principle of medieval warfare, violated chivalric codes, threw away fortunes in ransoms, and transformed Henry from triumphant king into war criminal by the standards of his own era. English soldiers refused. The order made no sense to men who just spent hours securing prisoners worth their weight in gold. Kill them? Throw away ransoms that could fund comfortable lives for decades? The soldiers thought Henry had lost his mind, assumed the order was misunderstood, ignored it, hoping clarification would come. Knights and men-at-arms who'd captured specific high-value prisoners were especially resistant. They'd earned those ransoms through combat, had legal rights to them under feudal law, weren't about to surrender fortunes on the king's apparent madness. Henry repeated the order with threats attached. Any soldier refusing to execute prisoners would be hanged immediately. The king wasn't requesting, he was commanding under penalty of death for disobedience. His reasoning was military necessity. The French were regrouping. His army couldn't guard prisoners and fight simultaneously. Armed prisoners would rejoin the battle if fighting resumed. The calculation was brutal. Dead prisoners couldn't threaten the English. Living prisoners were an active danger. Still, the soldiers resisted. Henry assigned the task to a specific unit when his own men wouldn't comply. Approximately 200 archers were ordered to execute prisoners, with understanding that refusal meant their own execution. These men had less stake in the prisoners. Archers didn't typically capture valuable nobles. Their captives were common soldiers worth minimal ransoms. They began the work with reluctance that quickly turned to mechanical efficiency. The slaughter started. Methods varied based on available resources and prisoner resistance. Wounded prisoners unable to resist had their throats cut where they lay. Mobile prisoners were herded into groups and killed en masse, some with swords through unarmoured areas, others with mallets crushing skulls, a few with axes to the neck. The killing was neither quick nor clean. It took time to murder hundreds of men, even when those men were exhausted, wounded, and already defeated. The screaming from the prisoner killing exceeded the battle's noise. Some French nobles who'd survived the battle died begging for mercy, while stating their names and offering escalating ransom amounts. English soldiers killed them anyway, ignoring pleas that would normally guarantee survival. The violation of warfare's fundamental rules was complete. Offering surrender and ransom normally meant safety, had meant safety for generations. Suddenly the rules had changed mid-battle without warning. French prisoners watched their fellows being executed and realized their own deaths were imminent regardless of rank or wealth or surrender. A few English soldiers couldn't stomach the work and refused despite threats. They were arrested but not executed. Henry's threat was mostly bluff. He couldn't afford hanging his own soldiers for refusing unlawful orders. The soldiers who did participate in the executions worked with grim determination, treating it like any other necessary military task. Kill these men now, or potentially die to them later. The logic was sound even if the morality was absent. The highest-ranking prisoners were spared, separated from the general population, placed under heavy guard. The Duke of Orleans, Duke of Bourbon, and perhaps 24 of the most valuable nobles watched their lesser companions being slaughtered and understood their survival was purely economic. They were worth too much to kill. Everyone else was worth more dead than alive given the strategic situation. Medieval warfare's economic calculations had turned lethal. Some prisoners were locked in buildings, barns, houses, whatever structures existed near the battlefield, and burned alive. This method required less direct participation from English soldiers and killed multiple prisoners simultaneously. The buildings were set afire with men trapped inside, doors barred, windows too small for armoured men to escape through. The screams from burning prisoners were audible across the battlefield, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. The prisoner massacre took approximately an hour, maybe longer, accounts vary. By the end, French prisoner population had been reduced from several thousand to a few dozen high-value nobles under close guard. The field was covered with fresh corpses, French soldiers who'd survived the battle only to be executed afterward. Some had died still believing they'd be ransomed, had died calling out their names and titles, convinced until their final moments that surely the English would honour the rules all European armies followed. The French forces regrouping behind the hill observed the massacre and didn't attack. Possibly they were deterred by what they'd seen happen to the vanguard. More likely they learned about the prisoner executions and lost all will to continue fighting an enemy who'd violated every code of honourable warfare. The French withdrew completely, heading back to their own territories, leaving the English in possession of the battlefield and the horrific evidence of what they'd done. Henry's justification for the massacre was military necessity. He claimed credible threat of renewed French attack, inability to guard prisoners adequately, danger of prisoners rejoining combat if fighting resumed. The justification was plausible, but not entirely convincing. The French forces behind the hill were withdrawing, not preparing to attack. The baggage train raid was minor and already resolved. The real motivation was probably simpler. Henry was terrified of losing despite his victory, was willing to commit atrocity to guarantee survival, chose murder over risk. The immediate aftermath saw English soldiers dealing with psychological trauma from participating in or witnessing the executions. Killing enemy soldiers in combat was acceptable, expected, honourable. Executing defeated prisoners who'd surrendered was murder by the standards of their own society. Some soldiers developed what modern medicine would recognise as PTSD, nightmares, anxiety, inability to discuss what they had done. The prisoner massacre affected English survivors as deeply as the battle itself, possibly more so. French survivors who escaped the battlefield carried news of the massacre back to France. The accounts were initially disbelieved. Surely the English hadn't violated every principle of chivalric warfare, hadn't murdered prisoners who'd offered surrender and ransom. Confirmation came from multiple sources. The massacre had happened. Henry V had ordered it. England had committed what medieval society considered a war crime, and done so while winning a battle they'd already won. The execution order's long-term consequences would complicate English-French relations for years. French soldiers in subsequent battles remembered Agincourt and what had happened to prisoners there. They fought more desperately, surrendered less willingly, showed less mercy to English prisoners in return. Henry's decision to massacre prisoners had poisoned the well of conventional warfare between the two kingdoms. Future battles would be bloodier because both sides remembered what happened when surrender didn't guarantee survival. The battlefield after the massacre was a vision of hell that chroniclers struggled to describe adequately. Corpses piled head-high in places, blood pooling in mud, creating red swamps that soldiers had to wade through. Wounded men who'd been overlooked during the massacre calling for help that wouldn't come. The smell of death was overwhelming. Blood, shit, burned flesh from the prisoners killed in buildings, decomposition already beginning in bodies exposed to afternoon sun. English soldiers wanted to leave immediately, abandon this field of horror, march to Calais and never think about Agincourt again. They couldn't leave yet. The formalities remained. French heralds approached under truce flags to formally concede the field, a ritual that had to occur for the victory to be officially recognised. The heralds surveyed the carnage with visible shock. They'd seen battles before, but nothing approaching this scale of death. Thousands of French dead. Nobles piled like cordwood. Evidence of prisoner executions everywhere. The heralds returned to their lines, conferred with surviving French commanders, came back with the formal concession. Henry asked the name of the nearest castle to establish what the battle would be called historically. Agincourt, the heralds replied. The battle would be Agincourt. Henry accepted the concession, claimed victory formally, and finally allowed his army to begin moving toward Calais. The march would take days and would be conducted by men haunted by what they'd survived and what they'd done. Victory tasted like ash and blood. The army departed the battlefield as afternoon faded toward evening. Behind them they left a field covered with perhaps 10,000 French dead. Exact numbers would never be known because nobody wanted to count. 3 dukes, 90 nobles of the highest rank, 1,500 knights, thousands of men-at-arms and common soldiers. An entire generation of French military leadership had been destroyed in a single afternoon. France's army had been annihilated. England's army had survived. The cost of that survival included England's honour and Henry's reputation as a chivalric king. The victory would be remembered, celebrated, immortalised in Shakespeare and history. The massacre would be remembered too, though less prominently, a dark footnote to England's greatest triumph. Henry had won his battle and lost something more important: the respect of his own era's military establishment. He'd broken the rules. He'd won, but at a price that wouldn't be fully calculated for generations. The march to Calais proceeded in silence. English soldiers were too exhausted for celebration, too traumatized for joy. They'd survived the impossible and committed the unthinkable. Victory and shame mixed together until neither was distinguishable from the other. They walked through Norman countryside as conquering heroes who felt like murderers, as survivors who'd lost something essential, as winners of a battle that felt like everyone had lost. France would never forget Agincourt. Neither would England. But the two kingdoms would remember different things. France would remember the slaughter and the massacre. England would remember the triumph, and conveniently forget the executions. History would be written by the victors, and the victors would sanitize their victory until it became legend. The truth would remain buried in that muddy field, along with 10,000 French dead. The march to Calais took 3 days through hostile countryside that had suddenly gone silent. French villages that should have resisted the English passage were abandoned. Their populations fled inland, carrying news of the slaughter. Norman peasants who'd watched the English army struggle northward weeks earlier now saw them returning as conquerors, diminished in numbers but carrying captured French banners as trophies. The silence was unnatural. No church bells, no market sounds, no evidence of normal life. France was holding its breath. English soldiers reached Calais on October 29th, 4 days after the battle. The garrison troops who'd been manning the fortress didn't recognise the army approaching. These weren't the 12,000 men who'd invaded in August. 6,000 skeletal figures in damaged armour, many wounded, all exhausted beyond anything the garrison had witnessed. The soldiers looked like they'd walked through hell, which was accurate. They'd left England as an invasion force and returned as survivors of a campaign that should have killed them all. The prisoner handling revealed the massacre's impact immediately. English soldiers who'd participated in the executions refused to discuss what happened. Others spoke in fragments, pieces of the story that didn't quite connect, accounts that contradicted each other, details that seemed too horrible to be true. The garrison troops initially assumed the stories were exaggerated, combat trauma producing false memories. Then the high-ranking French prisoners arrived under heavy guard, and their terrified faces confirmed that something unprecedented had occurred. The Duke of Orleans was broken. one of France's most powerful nobles, royal blood, accustomed to being treated with the respect his rank commanded. He'd watched hundreds of his fellow nobles executed despite offering surrender and ransom. He'd survived purely because his ransom value exceeded £100,000, making him too valuable to kill. The knowledge that his life had been spared for economic reasons while lesser nobles died had destroyed his sense of security completely. He wouldn't speak for days, just stared at nothing while under guard. News of Agincourt reached England before Henry's army did. Ships brought rumours, then reports, then confirmation. England erupted in celebration despite not fully understanding what had happened. They knew Henry had won a battle against impossible odds, had defeated a French army many times his size, had accomplished what seemed miraculous. The prisoner executions were mentioned in early reports, but downplayed as military necessity, unfortunate but required given the circumstances. England wanted to celebrate, not examine the morality of their king's decisions. Henry crossed the Channel in mid-November, timing his return for maximum political impact. London prepared celebrations that would dwarf anything the city had previously attempted. The king who'd invaded France against Parliament's advice, who'd nearly gotten his entire army killed through apparent strategic incompetence, was returning as a conquering hero who'd won England's greatest military victory in a generation. The narrative was being rewritten even before Henry set foot on English soil. The London celebration on November 23rd was deliberately designed to surpass anything in living memory. The city spent fortunes on decorations, pageants, displays, entertainment. Henry rode through streets lined with thousands of cheering citizens who had no accurate understanding of what had actually happened in France. They saw captured French banners, surviving English soldiers, and high-ranking French prisoners paraded as evidence of glorious victory. The darker aspects of the campaign, the dysentery, the starvation, the massacre, were invisible behind the spectacle. French reaction to Agincourt was delayed confusion turning to horror. Initial reports seemed impossible. France's finest army destroyed by a force 1/5 its size, 3 dukes dead, 90 senior nobles killed, 1,500 knights lost in a single afternoon. The numbers were so catastrophic they had to be exaggeration. Confirmation came from multiple sources. The disaster was real. France had lost an entire generation of military leadership in 3 hours. The political consequences manifested immediately. King Charles VI's madness meant he couldn't govern, but the nobles who normally ran France in his name were dead at Agincourt. The Dauphin Louis was young, inexperienced, and suddenly responsible for holding together a kingdom whose military establishment had been annihilated. Regional nobles who deferred to central authority began pursuing independent policies. Burgundy started manoeuvring for advantage. France was fragmenting under the weight of military catastrophe. The specific casualty lists revealed the disaster's depth. The Duke of Alençon, dead. The Duke of Brabant, dead. The Duke of Bar, dead. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, dead. Count Michel de la Pole, captured. Count Vendôme, dead. Count Marle, dead. Count Vaucourt, dead. Count Roussy, dead. The list continued for pages. France's nobility had been devastated. Some families lost multiple generations. Fathers, sons, brothers, all killed in the same battle. The economic impact was staggering. Each dead noble represented wealth removed from France's economy, estates left without leadership, regional power vacuums creating instability. The captured nobles' ransom payments would drain France's treasury for years. The Duke of Orleans alone was worth £100,000, enough to fund English military operations for an entire campaign season. France was paying for its own defeat while simultaneously trying to rebuild shattered military capacity. English strategic position transformed overnight. Before Agincourt, England held a few coastal towns and was considered a declining power in France. After Agincourt, England controlled the narrative, had broken France's military confidence, and possessed leverage through captured nobles to influence French internal politics. Henry wasn't just King of England anymore. He was the most feared military commander in Europe, the man who'd accomplished the impossible. The French response to the prisoner massacre complicated peace negotiations for years. France insisted the executions violated the laws of war, demanded formal apology, wanted prosecution of soldiers who'd participated. England claimed military necessity, pointed to the threat of renewed French attack, refused to acknowledge wrongdoing. The diplomatic impasse poisoned relations between kingdoms already at war. Future battles would be more brutal because both sides remembered Agincourt's lessons. The Treaty of Troy in 1420 was Agincourt's direct consequence, though 5 years delayed. Henry V forced France to accept terms that would have been unthinkable before the battle. Recognition of Henry as heir to the French throne, disinheritance of the Dauphin, marriage to French Princess Catherine, control over northern France. France agreed because they'd lost the military capacity to resist. Agincourt had broken not just their army, but their will to continue fighting a war they couldn't win. The battle's military lessons were studied by commanders across Europe. Terrain matters more than numbers. Mobility beats armour in poor conditions. Archers properly deployed can destroy heavy cavalry. Unified command is essential. Overconfidence kills. These lessons seem obvious now, but were revolutionary at the time. Medieval warfare had operated on assumptions about noble cavalry's superiority that Agincourt had disproven conclusively. Military doctrine would have to change. The longbow's effectiveness at Agincourt influenced English military policy for decades. England invested heavily in archery training, requiring regular practice by law, maintaining the supply of yew wood necessary for bow production. English military power for the next generation rested on longbowmen who could repeat Agincourt's performance. Other nations tried copying the longbow system and failed. Training archers required starting in childhood, decades of practice, cultural commitment England possessed but others couldn't replicate quickly. The French military reforms after Agincourt focused on avoiding repeat disaster. Professional infantry units replaced feudal levies. Artillery became increasingly important. Cavalry tactics were revised to avoid suicidal charges into prepared positions. The reforms worked. French armies of the 1420s and 1430s performed significantly better than the Agincourt generation. But the psychological damage persisted. French commanders were terrified of facing English longbowmen, sometimes refusing battle when tactical situation was actually favourable. Henry V's death in 1422 from dysentery, the same disease that had ravaged his army at Agincourt, created ironic symmetry. The king who'd survived the impossible died from mundane camp disease at age 35, having conquered half of France but not lived to consolidate his victories. His infant son inherited both the English and French thrones per the Treaty of Troy. The inheritance proved impossible to maintain. France would eventually recover, expel the English, and win the 100 Years' War. But that recovery took decades, and wouldn't have been necessary without Agincourt. The battle's cultural impact exceeded its military significance. Agincourt became legend, the story growing with each retelling. The sick, starving English army defeating overwhelming French forces through courage and divine providence. Henry's stirring speeches, invented by chroniclers, he'd said nothing particularly memorable. The English archer's defiance, embellished into mythic proportions, St. Crispin's Day becoming forever associated with English military glory. The reality was mud, blood, and horror. The legend was inspiration and national identity. Shakespeare's Henry V codified Agincourt in English cultural memory centuries after the battle. The play presented Henry as ideal Christian warrior king, the battle as righteous triumph, the campaign as justified reclamation of stolen lands. The prisoner massacre was mentioned briefly and justified. The dysentery was comic relief. The desperation became valour. Shakespeare's version replaced historical reality and popular consciousness, which was probably inevitable. Nobody wants to remember their national heroes as sick, terrified men who won through luck and committed atrocities. French memory of Agincourt was shame mixed with resentment. The battle represented everything wrong with French military establishment: overconfidence, poor coordination, aristocratic pride overriding tactical sense. French histories acknowledged the defeat but emphasized English treachery through the prisoner massacre, shifting blame from French incompetence to English dishonor. The truth was more complex. France had lost through their own failures. The massacre was separate atrocity that happened after the battle was decided. The battlefield itself became a site of grim tourism. Scavengers picked through the corpses for weeks after the battle, stripping armour, weapons, anything valuable. Local peasants found the field useful. Churned earth mixed with decomposing bodies made excellent fertilizer. Within a year, the killing ground was farmland again. No memorial marked where thousands had died. Medieval society didn't commemorate battlefields the way modern nations do. The dead were buried in mass graves and forgotten. The prisoners held in England became political pawns for years. The Duke of Orléans remained captive for 25 years, not released until 1440. Other nobles were held for ransoms their families couldn't afford, languishing in English castles for decades. Some died in captivity. Others were released penniless after their families sold estates to raise ransom money. The human cost of Agincourt extended far beyond the battlefield, destroying families and fortunes for generations. The battle's immediate aftermath saw England at the height of its medieval power. Henry V controlled northern France, had broken French military capacity, commanded respect throughout Europe. The achievement was temporary. England would eventually lose everything Henry had won, expelled from France except Calais by 1453. But for a decade after Agincourt, England was the dominant military power in Western Europe, feared and respected in equal measure. Agincourt's impact on medieval warfare's decline was profound but subtle. The battle demonstrated that aristocratic heavy cavalry, the military foundation of feudal society for centuries, could be defeated by common infantry armed with bows. If peasants could kill knights, what justified the social hierarchy based on military function? The question would take centuries to fully answer, but Agincourt planted seeds of doubt about feudalism's military justification that would eventually help undermine the entire system. The human cost was staggering and permanent. 10,000 French dead, most of them nobles and professional soldiers. Perhaps 400 English dead, many from disease rather than combat. An entire generation of French military leadership destroyed. Families ended. Estates left without heirs. Regional power structures collapsed. The casualty list didn't just represent individuals. They represented the destruction of France's military capacity for a decade. The survivors on both sides carried Agincourt with them for the rest of their lives. English soldiers who'd fought there became legends, their status as Agincourt veterans opening doors and commanding respect. French survivors bore shame for having failed, for having survived when their lords died, for having witnessed the greatest military humiliation in French history. Neither side escaped unchanged. Everyone who'd been at Agincourt had been transformed by it. The battle's final assessment reveals a paradox. England won their greatest victory and gained nothing permanent. France suffered their worst defeat and eventually won the war. Agincourt changed everything in the short term and nothing in the long term. English dominance proved temporary. French military reforms eventually succeeded. The 100 Years' War continued for another 38 years after Agincourt, ending in French victory and English expulsion from France. But the memory persisted. Centuries after the last veteran died, Agincourt remained alive in English consciousness as proof that impossible odds could be overcome, that courage and determination could triumph over superior numbers, that England could defeat anyone when fighting for righteous cause. The reality, sick, desperate men who survived through tactics, terrain advantages, French incompetence and atrocity was forgotten. The legend endured. France remembered differently. Agincourt was warning about aristocratic overconfidence, lesson in the cost of poor military coordination, permanent scar on national pride. French military doctrine changed because of Agincourt. French political structures evolved to prevent future disasters. The battle was educational catastrophe, teaching through bloodshed and shame lessons France would never forget. Agincourt was France's worst defeat because it didn't have to happen. Everything that went wrong was preventable. The poor coordination, the overconfidence, the tactical incompetence, the terrain selection, the decision to fight at all rather than waiting for the English to collapse from disease and starvation. France created its own disaster through pride, poor planning, and aristocratic hubris. The English won, but France defeated itself. The battle ended on October 25th, 1415, but its consequences echoed for centuries. Military tactics changed, political boundaries shifted, cultural memory was forged, and 10,000 men lay dead in a muddy field in northern France because one kingdom's pride met another kingdom's desperation, and the combination proved fatal. That was Agincourt. That was France's worst defeat. That was the day medieval warfare changed forever. The fundamental question haunts military historians 6 centuries later. How did France manage to lose so catastrophically when every advantage belonged to them? The answer isn't a single failure, but a cascading series of institutional, tactical, and cultural failures that compounded until disaster became inevitable. France didn't just lose a battle. They revealed that their entire military system was obsolete, their leadership incompetent, and their assumptions about warfare dangerously wrong. The first failure was strategic. France should never have fought at Agincourt. Henry's army was dying on its own. Disease, starvation, and exhaustion were accomplishing what French forces didn't need to risk battle to achieve. Every day the English marched brought them closer to collapse. Simply blocking the road to Calais and waiting would have forced English surrender within a week, maybe less. French commanders knew this. Their scouts reported English condition daily. Yet they chose battle anyway because honour demanded it, because letting the English escape without formal combat was considered cowardly, because aristocratic pride overrode military sense. The lack of unified command destroyed any possibility of coherent tactics. 3 dukes claimed authority, 90 senior nobles commanded independent forces, 1,500 knights owed allegiance to different lords. Nobody could issue orders everyone would follow. When Constable d'Albret suggested tactical approaches, nobles ignored him based on social rank rather than military merit. The result was an army incapable of coordinated action, where each contingent made independent decisions that contradicted others' plans. Modern military forces spend enormous resources establishing clear command structures, precisely because Agincourt demonstrated what happens without them. French obsession with individual glory actively undermined collective effectiveness. Knights fought for positions in the front line, the place of greatest danger and therefore greatest honour, rather than accepting assignments based on tactical necessity. The vanguard was overcrowded with nobles demanding front-rank positions, while rear echelons lacked sufficient forces because nobody wanted assignments considered less glorious. This wasn't just inefficient, it was suicidal. The overcrowding contributed directly to the compression that crushed French forces against English lines. The decision to fight dismounted revealed how thoroughly French military doctrine had failed to adapt to changing warfare. After Crécy and Poitiers demonstrated that cavalry charges into English longbowmen were suicide, French theorists concluded cavalry was obsolete rather than that their tactical application of cavalry needed refinement. Fighting on foot eliminated the horse vulnerability problem but created new weaknesses, reduced mobility, increased exhaustion from carrying armor's weight, inability to exploit breakthroughs. The French had learned the wrong lesson from previous defeats and doubled down on failed approaches. French confidence in armour technology was partially justified but catastrophically misapplied. Plate steel could stop arrows at the torso. Tests had proven this repeatedly. What French commanders hadn't adequately considered was that armour required gaps for mobility, that joints and connection points were vulnerable, that statistical probability meant some arrows would find those gaps when thousands were being shot. They tested armour against single shots, not against sustained bombardment by thousands of archers shooting tens of thousands of arrows. The scale problem destroyed their assumptions. The terrain selection was incomprehensible military malpractice. French forces chose to fight in a recently ploughed field after heavy rain, conditions that turned the ground into a quagmire that would obviously disadvantage heavy infantry. They selected a narrow front between woods that prevented deploying their numerical superiority and channeled their forces into a killing zone. They gave the English slightly elevated ground that provided drainage advantage and tactical benefit. Every terrain decision favoured England. French commanders either didn't understand basic military geography or were so confident that terrain didn't matter, they ignored it entirely. The timing failures compounded throughout the battle. Cavalry charged before infantry was positioned to exploit any breakthrough. Infantry advanced before cavalry had cleared English archers. The second line pushed forward before the first line had engaged effectively. The third line never deployed because nobody coordinated their use with earlier attacks. Each element of French forces fought independently, attacking at different times in different ways without mutual support. The result was that France's numerical superiority became irrelevant. They were feeding forces piecemeal into English defences rather than overwhelming them with simultaneous pressure. The crossbowman's misuse represented criminal incompetence. France had thousands of professional crossbowmen who could have suppressed English archers during the advance, providing cover for the infantry assault. Instead, they were positioned poorly, couldn't get clear firing lanes, received no orders, and contributed essentially nothing to the battle. Proper use of missile troops required coordination with infantry advances, something that demanded unified command structure France lacked. The crossbowmen stood uselessly while French knights died under English arrows they could have countered. French failure to adapt during battle revealed institutional rigidity fatal in medieval combat. English tactics were obvious after the first French cavalry charge failed. The wooden stakes stopped horses, the arrow storm targeted gaps in armour, the narrow front prevented flanking. French commanders could see what was happening and had hours to develop countermeasures. They didn't. They just kept sending more knights forward into the same killing zone using the same failed approaches. Tactical flexibility requires authority to change plans mid-battle, which French fractured command structure couldn't provide. The cultural factors underlying French failure ran deeper than tactical incompetence. French military establishment was built on assumptions about noble superiority that were fundamentally wrong but culturally unquestionable. Knights were superior warriors because of birth, training, and divine favour. Peasant archers were beneath contempt regardless of their demonstrated effectiveness. Chivalric codes mattered more than victory. These beliefs were so deeply embedded in French aristocratic culture that questioning them was essentially impossible. France couldn't adapt because adaptation would require abandoning cultural foundations their entire society was built on. The economic structure of French feudalism contributed to military failure. Nobles maintained their own forces, equipped them according to personal preference, trained them in family traditions rather than standardized doctrine. This created military diversity that prevented coordination. Some contingents used different tactics than others. Equipment varied wildly. Training standards were inconsistent. A modern military force achieves effectiveness through standardization. Everyone trained the same way, using the same equipment, following the same doctrine. French forces were a collection of private armies that happened to share a common enemy. French intelligence failures were staggering. Scouts reported English condition accurately. Disease-ridden, starving, exhausted, barely combat-capable. French commanders received this information and ignored it. Assumed English weakness meant easy victory rather than recognizing desperate men fight hardest. They underestimated English tactical competence, dismissed longbowmen as peasant rabble, despite 50 years of evidence proving their effectiveness, and assumed French nobility's innate superiority would triumph regardless of circumstances. Every intelligence assessment was correct, but every strategic conclusion drawn from that intelligence was wrong. The prisoner massacre's impact on future French military performance can't be overstated. French soldiers in subsequent battles knew surrendering didn't guarantee survival, that English might execute prisoners regardless of ransom offers. This knowledge made French forces fight more desperately, surrender less readily, and show no mercy to English prisoners in return. The massacre poisoned conventional warfare between the kingdoms, making future conflicts more brutal and costly for both sides. Henry's decision to execute prisoners achieved short-term security at the cost of long-term strategic complications. The political consequences of Agincourt exposed France's systemic weaknesses. With King Charles VI incapacitated by madness and the nobles who normally governed killed in battle, France had no functional central authority. Regional powers began pursuing independent policies. Burgundy allied with England against the French crown. The Dauphin couldn't control nobles who'd previously deferred to central authority. France's political structure required strong nobility to function, and Agincourt had killed that nobility. The kingdom fragmented under stress it should have been able to withstand. The generational impact devastated France's military capacity for decades. Agincourt didn't just kill individual soldiers, it killed fathers, sons, brothers, entire family lines. Some noble houses lost multiple generations in a single afternoon. The military knowledge, tactical experience, and leadership capability those men possessed died with them. Training the next generation of French military leadership took years, during which England consolidated gains and expanded their control. France couldn't recover quickly, because recovery required rebuilding human capital that can't be replaced rapidly. The financial disaster compounded military catastrophe. Ransoms for captured nobles drained France's treasury. The Duke of Orleans alone cost £100,000, equivalent to England's total annual royal revenue. Families bankrupted themselves buying back captured relatives. Estates were sold to raise ransom money. The wealth that should have funded French military rebuilding instead flowed to England, financing further English conquests. France was paying for their own continued defeat, funding English military operations through ransom payments. The psychological damage to French military confidence lasted beyond the physical recovery. French commanders became terrified of facing English longbowmen, seeing Agincourt replays in every tactical situation. This fear led to overcaution refusing battle when circumstances were actually favourable, ceding initiative to England repeatedly. The psychological victory England gained at Agincourt proved more valuable than the tactical victory. They'd broken French will to fight, creating doubt that persisted even after France rebuilt military capacity. The lesson other European powers drew from Agincourt accelerated medieval warfare's transformation. Heavy cavalry's dominance was ending, proven by English longbowmen repeatedly defeating French knights. Infantry armed with polearms, pikes and bows could defeat aristocratic cavalry when properly deployed. The military foundation of feudal society, the armoured knight as ultimate warrior, was obsolete. The social implications were profound. If peasants could kill nobles in battle, what justified the social hierarchy based on military function? Agincourt didn't cause feudalism's decline, but it provided evidence that the system was dying. English tactical innovations at Agincourt became standard practice across Europe. Defensive positions with stakes and obstacles, combined arms integration of archers and men-at-arms, terrain selection that maximised advantages and minimised enemy strengths. These concepts seem obvious now, but were revolutionary at the time. Medieval warfare had operated on assumptions about cavalry superiority and noble combat prowess that Agincourt had thoroughly disproven. Future successful armies would incorporate lessons England taught at Agincourt. The Treaty of Troy in 1420 formalised Agincourt's consequences. Henry V gained recognition as heir to France's throne, married the French princess, controlled northern France, and effectively reduced France to English client state. These terms would have been unthinkable before Agincourt. France accepted them because they lacked military capacity to resist, and feared another crushing defeat more than they feared subordination to England. The treaty ultimately failed. Henry died young. France eventually recovered and expelled the English. But for a decade it seemed like England had won the 100 Years' War. The irony was that England's Agincourt victory proved temporary, while France's defeat proved educational. England won the battle and gained nothing permanent. France lost catastrophically, but learned lessons that eventually produced military reforms, enabling their ultimate victory. French armies of the 1430s and 1440s avoided Agincourt's mistakes. They had unified command, better coordination, realistic tactical doctrine, and healthy respect for English capabilities. These reformed French forces eventually reconquered all English holdings in France except Calais, winning the 100 Years' War 3 decades after Agincourt. The deeper question is why France needed to learn through catastrophic defeat what should have been obvious from previous battles. Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 had demonstrated English longbow effectiveness, French cavalry vulnerability, and the importance of terrain and tactics over raw numbers. Yet France learned nothing, repeated the same mistakes at Agincourt, and suffered even worse defeat. The answer lies in institutional and cultural rigidity that prevented adaptation even when survival required it. France's aristocratic military establishment couldn't abandon assumptions their entire social structure was built on until disaster forced change. Agincourt was France's worst defeat because it was preventable, catastrophic, and revelatory all at once. Preventable because every mistake could have been avoided with competent leadership. Catastrophic because it destroyed an entire generation of French military leadership and enabled English conquest of half of France. Revelatory because it exposed that French military system was fundamentally broken in ways that required complete reconstruction. The battle didn't just kill 10,000 Frenchmen, it killed the old way of warfare and forced creation of new military doctrine that would eventually enable French victory. The human cost: 10,000 dead, thousands more captured and impoverished by ransoms, families destroyed, estates bankrupted, was staggering but almost incidental to the institutional consequences. France lost far more than an army at Agincourt. They lost confidence, military credibility, political coherence, financial stability, and most importantly, the comfortable assumptions their entire military establishment had operated on for generations. Rebuilding all of that took decades and required France to become a fundamentally different kind of military power. The final judgment on Agincourt's significance must acknowledge both its immediate impact and its long-term irrelevance. England won spectacularly and gained nothing that lasted. France lost catastrophically and eventually won the war. Medieval warfare transformed, but feudal society persisted for centuries more. The battle changed everything in the moment and nothing in the long term. Yet it remains remembered 600 years later because it represents something essential about warfare: that courage, tactics, and luck can overcome overwhelming numerical superiority, that overconfidence kills, that desperate men fighting for survival are the most dangerous opponents possible. Agincourt was France's worst defeat, but it was also France's necessary defeat, the catastrophe that finally forced change France had needed for generations. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to learn what matters. France learned at Agincourt. The lesson cost 10,000 lives, destroyed a generation, and humiliated a proud kingdom. But ultimately France learned, and that made all the difference.